Okay, well, welcome everyone to this meeting of the Maine Climate Council. It's exciting to have folks here today. If you are a member of the Maine Climate Council, you will be working your way up here as a panelist. We have a team of folks in the background promoting you up into this as a panelist. Everyone else, thanks for joining us. I'm just going to say a few technical words and then turn it over to your co-chairs, the Maine Climate Council. We are in a Zoom webinar today. Climate counselors and presenters are going to be as panelists here, and you'll see their faces on the screen. Everybody else will be attendees. After the break and during the break, if you're a working group member of the Maine Climate Council, you'll be invited to come up and be part of that workshop as well. So stay tuned for that. We'll give you some more instruction about that. You'll get promoted up to be a panelist as well during the break today. That's all you'll hear from me. If you have any questions about what's going on, Molly Siegel is going to drop an email in the chat to everyone, and you can send an email to that address if you're having trouble with the webinar today, or if you're a climate counselor and you're not being promoted up to a panelist, just send an email to what Molly's going to drop in the chat in just a moment. Let me turn it over to your co-chairs now, Hannah Pingree and Melanie Loisem, to get us going today. Hannah, over to you.
Great. Well, thank you, David, and thank you to everyone tuning in this morning. I'm in a Zoom closet in Augusta. My name is Hannah Pingree. I'm the director of the Governor's Office of Policy Innovation in the Future. I'm also the co-chair of the Maine Climate Council. I'm here with Commissioner Melanie Loisem, who co-chairs the council with me. And we're incredibly excited to have such a big turnout to talk about both science and climate impacts and how we think about equity as we do our work. So just a quick reminder of where we are in time. This is a quarterly meeting of the Maine Climate Council. We have invited both Maine Climate Council members as well as all of the working group and subcommittee members to participate in this meeting today. I think as all the folks who are working hard as a part of the Climate Council process know, we have another deadline of producing another 4-year climate action plan by December 1 of this year, 2024. And today is another important step, as I think we all think across all of our working groups about the impacts that we understand that scientists are telling us about the impact of climate on the state of Maine. So I will be very brief. The first half of this meeting is our agenda is to hear from the scientists, and the second half is to undertake a workshop where we think about climate impacts more specifically and how we think about equity in that context. So I mostly just want to say to all the Climate Council members who are in their working groups, thank you for the hard work you are doing. Our Climate Council working groups are meeting at least monthly. They are really digging into the tough issues of how we update our climate plan in a way that helps Maine achieve our climate goals and prepare for the climate impacts we are seeing in the state. I think many folks were with us in January for an emergency climate council meeting to really think about resilience and the impacts of the storms that we saw in both December and January. And in my hometown, we had another big storm last weekend, and I know that the information that we hear this morning will be incredibly relevant. So with that, I will pass it off to my co-chair, Melanie Loisem. And again, I thank you all for tuning in and being with us here this morning.
Thanks, Hannah. Good morning. As Director Pingree said, I'm Melanie Loisem, Commissioner of the Department of Environmental Protection, in addition to being co-chair of the Maine Climate Council. Before we go into our presentation, I wanted to say thanks to the 3 co-chairs of the Science and Technical Subcommittee and all of its members for the incredibly hard work that you've all been doing. Dr. Fernandez, Dr. Arnold, and Dr. Dixon have been leading a tremendous group of scientists doing this work. They're the first of the groups in the council that needs to provide their information, to provide the information that you need and the work that you're doing in your working groups. The basis for the Maine Climate Council, when it was created, was to have the basis for all of our decisions be based on the best available science. And so it's the Science and Technical Subcommittee that we rely on to have that updated information to inform the work that you're all going to be doing. There's a lot of information that you're going to hear this morning, and that's just an overview of the report that the Science and Technical Subcommittee will be producing sometime around late April. So there'll be a lot more information to digest once that becomes available. And I think in particular today, some of the interesting things you're going to be hearing about are a new part of the discussion with the Science and Technical Subcommittee, which includes the human dimension, and my particular favorite, the science of hope from Dr. Susie Arnold. So thank you, all of you, for the really hard work you've been doing and for taking the time this morning to walk us through it. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Ivan Fernandez.
Thank you, Commissioner Loisem and Director Pingree, and good morning to members of the council and working groups and subgroups, and in some cases subgroups, and all that are in attendance here this morning. Molly Siegel is controlling our slide, so you're going to hear us all say, "Next slide, please," and we greatly appreciate your help, Molly. And right now, I'd say next slide, please. So my charge is to get us started here this morning. I'm Ivan Fernandez from the University of Maine, and co-chair of the Science and Technical Subcommittee. We appreciate the opportunity for STS to be here this morning to talk briefly about some of the need-to-know messages that are emerging from our client science assessment work. The STS is comprised of over 40 scientists with expertise about the effects of Maine on a changing climate, excuse me, and the effects of changing climate on Maine. In addition, we're honored to have 4 members of the Maine legislature as a bipartisan component of the STS team. While we read in the news almost every day about climate change here in Maine and around the world, and it's often hard to keep up, those stories are most often about the impacts of extreme events and not about the science. The images you see here on this introductory slide are pictures of our Maine scientists doing the work that they do every day here in Maine to understand the climate challenge. Some of them you'll hear from in a few minutes. The focus of our climate assessment work in STS is about the emerging science from these researchers and others focused specifically on Maine. Next slide, please. It's a little slow. The Scientific and Technical Subcommittee of the Maine Climate Council was established in 2019 as part of the legislation signed by Governor Mills that created the work that we all do here in the council subcommittees and working groups. We as STS are, quote unquote, charged to identify, monitor, study, and report out to the council and to the working groups findings and recommendations related to climate change in the state and its effects on the state's climate, species, marine and coastal environments and natural landscape, and on the oceans and other bodies of water. Next slide, please. What we hear about the most in international and national climate policy debates is the science from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or the IPCC, and the National Climate Assessment, which is carried out by the United States Global Change Research Program. We've discussed these reports before in this forum. These are incredibly influential climate science assessment initiatives that have a profound impact, particularly on policy among nations and among states. Next slide, please. What are some of the key messages we can take away from these international, national assessments and other broader science assessments? For planet Earth, the 10 hottest years in the 174-year global record were the last 10 years. 2023 was the hottest year on record. 2024 will likely be the same. To our grandchildren looking back later in this century, these will be the cool years, and not in a good way. Most indicators of a changing climate are accelerating, meaning not only is change continuing, but it continues at a faster and faster pace. This includes temperature, sea level rise, sea surface temperature, melting ice, and the frequency of events like flooding, drought, storm surges, and wildfires. Here in Maine, we all have memorized the dates of December 18, January 10, January 13, and now for many, March 10th, just in the last few months. The cost of climate change is also accelerating, rising to a record 28 climate disasters in 2023 in the US that cost more than $1 billion each. And the cumulative cost since 1980 of those billion-dollar disasters is over $2.6 trillion. Those don't count the everyday, quote unquote, costs of climate change, much as we've experienced here in Maine in the past few months. The latest IPCC report emphasizes that every fraction of a degree of warming avoided matters, underscoring that every action we take is critical. 1.5 and 2 degrees centigrade are not all or nothing thresholds. Yet progress to date is not enough. We can celebrate the future that we have already avoided, the counterfactual that would be happening right now if it were not for efforts to date. But we also need to deal with the fact that reductions in greenhouse gas emissions have not yet stopped the increasing warming. And we need to both stop emitting human-caused greenhouse gases and begin to draw down the legacy of accumulations in the atmosphere. Last month, February 2024, concentrations of atmospheric CO2 were 424 parts per million. That's 4 parts per million higher, not lower, than February 2023, and still heading in the wrong direction. Yet we absolutely should celebrate the unfolding evidence of accelerating climate solutions as well represented by the Maine Climate Council's annual progress report and dashboard. Here in Maine, this group and many others are driving this urgent transition, and our focus on science this morning is meant to support that work in the most informed, up-to-date, equitable, and cost-effective ways possible. Next slide, please. To support that decision-making in the Council, STS focuses on a more granular and more local science assessment to guide climate-relevant policy and management for Maine communities, businesses, fisheries, farms, and forests. The 2024 report will build on and update recent science from 2020 and 2021, as we previously reported. What we hope to convey in the next few minutes is short need-to-know information that's emerging from our science assessment work. Speakers are not speaking on behalf of their home institutions, but as individuals and members of STS. David Plum will be keeping us on time to the best of his abilities, and will be overseeing a moment of reflections or time slot for reflections at the end of our comments this morning. We're tentatively planning, as Director Pingree, I think, alluded to, additional public engagement on the outcomes of the STS assessment work sometime in April. Next slide, please. So let us begin. This agenda represents the sequence of presenters that you will be hearing in a few moments. They are all short presentations meant to focus on those highlights. And David Plum will keep us on time. Logically, we'll start with climate. And so I'm happy to turn it over to Dr. Sean Burkle, our Maine State climatologist, to briefly introduce himself and begin our proceedings. And I'd ask each of the speakers after that to briefly introduce themselves as they begin their comments. So thank you and welcome this morning. Next slide, please. Sean.
Thank you for the introduction, Dr. Fernandez. As Ivan said, my name is Sean Burkle, and I am an assistant professor with a joint appointment between the Climate Change Institute and Cooperative Extension at the University of Maine, and I'm also the Maine State climatologist. And for the next several minutes, I'd like to share with you some updates on the climate section of the STS report that's in progress. Next slide, please. In this slide, I want to convey an underlying and ongoing key message that as Maine's climate continues to get warmer and wetter, and we are seeing more extremes. And to set the stage with the temperature and precipitation trends historically, as you can see on the right of the slide, temperatures increased by about 3.5 degrees Fahrenheit since 1895. Overnight low temperatures have risen more than daytime highs, and all 10 of the warmest years in this record period have occurred since 1998, including the years since the last STS report. And warming is projected to range anywhere from 2 to 10 degrees Fahrenheit, depending on greenhouse gas emission scenario, and that is for the end of the century. Precipitation, likewise, is increasing. Maine's climate is getting wetter. There's been an increase of about 6 inches over the past century. We're also seeing more heavy precipitation events, 2 inches per day, 3 inches per day, as well as sub-daily precipitation events. Precipitation is projected to increase 5 to 14% annually on average by the end of the century. And and climate models do project that we will see more extreme rainfall events. Next slide, please. And as the climate warms, the hydrologic cycle is intensifying. And that relates to there being more moisture in the atmosphere, warmer ocean surface temperatures, and that is driving more extremes, both on the weather timescale as well as longer timescales, such as seasonal timescales. And we recently saw 2 very contrasting examples. Drought in 2020, and that was within several years of varying levels of dryness across the state. But in 2020, that was the really severe year in which there was drought disaster declaration in September. And it was the driest May through September period on a statewide average since 1895. And then 3 years later, this past May through September was the second wettest on record. And these are the types of extremes that are associated with an intensification of the hydrologic cycle in a warming climate. And we need to be prepared to manage extremes of this sort, again, both on weather timescales and on seasonal timescales. Next slide, please. As has already been alluded to, recent storms in December, in January, and another one this month. The major coastal storm surge, inland flooding, and electrical grid impacts from these storms have generated significant concern about future trends. And the available information so far, historical analyses that are available, do not show clear trends in storm frequency. Although very recently we have seen a notable uptick, unusually active weather pattern, and underlying that was the climate background of record high temperatures in 2023, and globally as well as across the North Atlantic Ocean, which was a significant contributor to these weather extremes, as well as conditions in the Pacific. Climate models project that warming, most climate models project that warming will produce more intense storms, but the signal for frequency, for the number of storms, is less clear. Some models show a reduced number of extratropical cyclones. But it's clear there's more research that is needed to understand the historical incidence of storms, different times of the year, in particular southeasterlies, storms such as what we saw in December and January that produced strong, very damaging southeaster winds. And that work is continuing. Next slide, please. On the first slide, you saw that mean annual temperature increased by about 3.5 degrees Fahrenheit over the past century. Now, that might not seem like much. However, this figure, which shows the temperature annual cycles for 3 climate periods, averaged 1901 to 2000 in blue, 2010 to 2023 in orange, and projected to 2050 in dark red. This highlights how what may seem at first as a small increase in temperature actually has major implications for natural systems and heat accumulation. If we now also look at the dashed horizontal line in bold, that's the 32 degree Fahrenheit line, the transition between either melting or freezing. if we compare those curves to the freezing line throughout the year, we can then see the relative change in the length of the warm season versus the cold season, and also get a sense for, in a warming climate, there's more accumulation of heat in the summertime, more degree days, and in the wintertime, fewer freezing degrees accumulate. And the associations are relate to snowpack. We're seeing decreasing snowpack, earlier snowmelt in the spring, different timing, earlier timing of spring runoff. This is a very early spring this year, as an example. Changes in lake ice out towards earlier ice out, as well as later onset of ice, later snowfall, reduced winter. And it's all associated with warming, but it links very closely to the relative length of the seasons and then natural systems and agriculture and everything is responding to this. It's the addition of heat throughout the year.
John,
Next
this is
slide.
your friendly reminder. It's like the music started to play at the Oscars. This is me.
Okay. And in the last slide is freshwater quality. Recent studies pertaining to the effects of climate change on freshwater resources continue to support the results from our 2020 report. And an important addition is the concept of resilience as it pertains to water quality. Water body features are only one aspect of resilience. Because water bodies exist within watersheds, both land uses and social aspects must be considered. And that's an important part of our ongoing work. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Sean. That's really helpful. Next person up is Cindy Eisenhower, and is going to talk about the human dimensions. I'm going to get titles wrong, and there's a lot of PhDs and doctors here. So Cindy, apologies, and everyone else, I'm not going to get all those titles right. But Cindy, you're up next. Thanks.
Thank you, David. Yes, good morning, everyone. My name is Cindy Eisenhower. I'm a professor of anthropology and climate change at the University of Maine in Orono. And I'm honored and pleased to be able to present to you a new section of the Science and Technological Subcommittee report that is focused on the human dimensions. Now, this is a very big topic, and given the time frame, we've chosen to go to narrow our scope a bit in this first iteration and hope to bring more content in future iterations. But today I'll share with you some of our highlights from the report that is still under development. If I could have the next slide, please. Okay, so we are focusing in this first iteration on social and economic impacts, on vulnerability, and on resilience. So our first slide is on the social and economic impacts, and I don't think it comes as news to anyone on the call that we are already experiencing both social and economic impacts from climate change here in Maine, particularly with the recent storms we've had. But we do have we're very fortunate to have some great science happening here in Maine and nationally that helps us to understand that we see growing social costs of CO2 pollution, and those costs can be quantified and aggregated, but that the impacts are much more than just monetary. We also see impacts of storms and sea level rise and drought on place-based heritage and on our identities. And those identities are linked to well-being, which has some really important implications for the health impacts, which my colleagues will talk about in a few minutes. We also understand, based on the science, that many projections are uncertain. So in some places, we understand that, yes, there are going to be projected increases in, for example, demand for civil and governmental services, but other projections are less clear, faced by a lot of uncertainty. So for example, we have markets that are responding to climate change here in Maine. Some of those responses are very hopeful. For example, solar markets and alternative energy markets are responding, but other market responses could present additional hardships. So for example, thinking about things like winter tourism markets or the responses of insurance markets as climate continues to impact our state. In the report, we pay particular attention to the housing market and thinking about factors such as migration around the state and into the state, as well as the impacts from ongoing storm events. If I could have the next slide, please. The second section of our report focuses on vulnerability, and this has some really important key tie-ins to the workshop we'll have later this morning. But important to note is that Mainers experience differential levels of vulnerability, and that the factors that relies upon, it's not just where we live and our exposure to physical climate risks like flooding, drought, or heat, but it's also linked to levels of social vulnerability that have to do with deep systemic inequalities. We have some segments of our population that are exposed to more climate risk because of those inequalities. And it's also a function of adaptive capacity. So what types of economic sensitivities do we have where we live to climate impacts, as well as governance structure and capacity and factors like information. So it's important to understand those differential levels of vulnerability because it really does matter. We unfortunately have much more evidence than I would like that policies can actually exacerbate vulnerabilities if they're not designed with issues of equity and justice from the very start. And we also understand that vulnerability can be reduced through inclusive design. And what that means essentially is participatory decision-making, right? Making sure that everybody is involved in climate governance. And we feature in the report, for example, a focus on Indigenous sovereignty and decision-making and inclusion, which is extremely important for our Indigenous colleagues in the state. Reducing vulnerability can also result in really important co-benefits, which can lead to more effective climate action, not only on the mitigation side, but also on the adaptation side. Next slide, please. And finally, we focus in our report on adaptation and resilience, pulling away some important lessons from the science conducted both here in Maine and around the world. So one thing we want to really emphasize is that when we think about adapting to climate change and building resilience, we oftentimes think about physical infrastructure and technology. And it's important to also recognize that we need investments in social institutions and infrastructures. So the report does emphasize the importance of social capital, so building trust, building community links. Scholars in the state have identified the need for collaboration and capacity building at the municipal level. So building in social capital, building those ties. And this idea is really linked to notions of care across scale. So not only care for the climate and ecology, but also for each other and the work that we need to do to work together to solve the climate issue. And that involves building infrastructures for participatory governance, making sure that everyone has a seat at the table. And finally, I'm running out of time here, but I just wanted to note that the latest IPCC assessment report did do what we could call like a meta-analysis of global studies on adaptation success and identified these 6 characteristics of adaptation programs across scales that can lead to adaptation success. And I'm happy to say that Maine has been a leader in many of these areas, including developing good information, making political commitments, institutionalizing planning, and policies with clear goals, finance, and the thing I really want to emphasize once again is inclusive governance. We can't leave people behind. Thank you so much, and I'll pass it to our next presenter.
Thanks, Cindy. Rebecca Lincoln, you're up next.
Thank you, David and Cindy, and good morning. I'm Rebecca Lincoln. I'm an environmental epidemiologist at Maine CDC, and I'll be discussing the STS's findings on human health impacts of climate change. Next slide, please. So I'll be highlighting 4 points this morning from our section of the forthcoming STS report. First, we continue to see impacts of extreme weather on human health in Maine and elsewhere. It's projected that Maine will experience more frequent and severe heat events, and research in progress suggests that in Maine, men and middle-aged adults experience disproportionate rates of heat illness, and that working outdoors or in a hot environment is also a significant risk factor. We've also seen that recent extreme heat in temperate areas of the US, most notably the Pacific Northwest in 2021, has caused significant morbidity and mortality. And these events show the risks extreme heat can present in areas with a climate like Maine's and highlight the ongoing need for adaptation for these events. There's also accumulating evidence for the variety and significance of health impacts caused by extreme heat exposure, such as adverse pregnancy, birth, and pediatric outcomes, kidney disease, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, and mental and behavioral health outcomes. And other types of extreme weather events, of course, can also have significant health impacts as well. The severe storm we experienced on December 18th caused at least 4 confirmed deaths, as well as dozens of emergency department visits for injuries, hypothermia, carbon monoxide poisoning due to improper generator use, mental and behavioral health outcomes, and outcomes associated with interrupted access to prescription medications, electric-powered medical devices, and medical care. Next slide, please. We also see increasing evidence in the literature for a wide range of adverse mental health impacts, from direct exposure to a climate hazard, such as an extreme storm or heat wave, as well as indirectly through climate anxiety, especially among young people. And at the same time, rates of diagnosable mental health disorders remain high in Maine, as in other parts of the US and the world, and there are stubborn and persistent gaps between the existing need and available services. So these findings suggest to us that efforts to expand and improve Maine's mental health services should account for the potential mental health impacts of a changing climate. And likewise, that emergency preparedness efforts should account for the likely need for additional mental health services during and following natural disasters and other emergencies. Next slide. Another notable public health impact of climate change in Maine is a potential increase in vector-borne diseases. A warmer, wetter Maine climate is likely to support increasing populations of ticks and mosquitoes that carry harmful diseases. But it's important to note that this is only likely where habitat is otherwise suitable and where host populations such as white-tailed deer are numerous. Black-legged or deer ticks are established in southern Maine and continue to increase in northern Maine. These ticks carry a range of diseases, and we continue to see annual increases in many of them, especially Lyme disease, with a preliminary but record-breaking 2,943 cases reported in 2023. Lone star ticks are more common in southeastern and southern central states, but are appearing more frequently in Maine, and these ticks also carry a range of diseases, including alpha-gal syndrome or red meat allergy, 8 cases of which were identified in Maine in 2023. And finally, human cases of mosquito-borne diseases luckily continue to be rare in Maine, but last summer saw notable viral activity, including a veterinary outbreak of eastern equine encephalitis and reports of multiple mosquito populations carrying triple E, West Nile virus, and Jamestown Canyon virus. Next slide. And finally, we want to note that climate change may have an impact on air quality in Maine. The East Coast, as we know, saw significant episodes of poor air quality from Canadian wildfires last summer. And although Maine was largely spared the worst impacts experienced by our neighboring states because of favorable weather conditions, this continues to be an area of concern. Recent research suggests that although large-scale wildfires remain more common in the Western US, most of the projected health impacts from exposure to wildfire smoke are likely to occur on the East Coast due to higher population density. So this is not just an issue for our West Coast and Canadian neighbors to pay attention to. And other climate-related aspects of air quality are also important, including likely increases in pollen and other aeroallergens as the growing season warms and lengthens. Overall, we note that better tools are needed to track, understand, and respond to these issues, and Maine CDC is working with DEP to develop and publish a wildfire and air quality data dashboard, which is shown here in development, and to implement a statewide pollen monitoring network to help meet this need. We're hoping that both of these efforts will be up and running by this summer. And with that, I'll close. Thank you.
Thanks, Rebecca. Fantastic, although daunting. Peter Slavinsky is up next on sea level rise and storm surge. Peter, all yours.
Thank you, David. My name is Peter Slavinsky. I'm a marine geologist with the Maine Geological Survey and the Department of Agriculture, Conservation, and Forestry. I'm going to share with you some takeaways on our sea level rise and storm surge chapter. Next slide, please. The first is that sea level continues to rise in Maine at approximately global rates in terms of the short term and the long term. Our long-term trend has been about 1.9 millimeters per year, while over the last 30-year period or so, that's almost doubled to about 3.6 millimeters per year. So our 30-year trend is accelerating. And from 2022 to 2023, our rate of sea level rise actually increased in about 0.18 to 0.26 feet during that time period. And to give you some context, the rate over the last decade has been 0.12 feet per year. And 2023 also set a number of records in terms of mean sea levels. The chart on the right shows you monthly records in red, while yellow is showing whether or not those values fell within the top three. And 2024 has continued to this trend with a new mean record set for January. Next slide, please. So what is causing this? I'll tell you now, we're not quite sure, but in 2010, we had a period of about a year where sea levels were about 5 to 6 inches above average. And that was due to two factors. The first was what we call a negative phase of the North Atlantic Oscillation, which is the way pressure systems set up over Greenland and the Azores and create a blocking pattern that drives the jet stream south and steers storms up the coastline and creates a weak onshore flow. We typically have a good correlation between negative NAO phases and higher than normal sea levels. At the same time, in 2010, there was a slowdown in what we call the Atlantic Meridional Overturning Circulation, which is a current system that basically brings very warm water from the tropics northward. That water becomes denser and colder and sinks, and over time returns. And a slowdown in this system can actually exacerbate sea level change along the east coast of the United States. Next slide, please. A finding that we have is that new sea level rise scenarios released in 2022 tell us that our commit to manage sea level rise scenario remains valid. This graph is showing a long-term trend in the black line, and there's a little call-out box showing 2000 to 2050 for Portland, and a low, intermediate, and high scenarios. And our commit to manage targets are those black circles, and we fall within the likely range of the new intermediate scenario. However, our prepare to manage scenario shifts about 2 decades later. You'll also notice that we provide scenarios out to the year 2150 now, and that's because sea level is expected to continue to rise beyond the year 2100. And a lot of uncertainty remains about ice sheet loss contributing to that. Next slide, please. Another takeaway is that nuisance flooding has increased over the long term. The graph on the left is showing you the long-term trend in a dashed blue line. Each of the blue bars is nuisance floodings per day. And the average of the long terms is about 4 flood days since 1912. And over the last, since 2010, that's up to about 12. So 3 times the historic average. On the right-hand side is a graph showing where that is expected to go in response to sea level rise and a change in the lunar nodal cycle. The lunar nodal cycle will amplify the tides. They will become higher, such that by the mid-2035s, we could see about 42 flood days per year. Next slide, please. I want to finish just sharing with you some information about the January 10th and 13th storm events. This slide is showing the tide component in dark blue for Portland, Bar Harbor, and Eastport, and the storm surge component in bright red. And on top of that, you'll see for the January 10th and 13th events, you'll see a little pink box on top of that. And that's that abrupt sea level change in 2023 that we've experienced, in 2024, actually. And that's enhanced the impacts of these storm events, such that we've seen first and second storm events at the highest water levels in Bar Harbor, the first in Portland, and the fourth in Eastport from those events. And just to give you some context to that, the March 10th storm events resulted in the 8th highest water level in Portland, the 3rd highest in Bar Harbor, so that's knocked the historic storm out from the 3rd place, and the 7th highest in Eastport. So these trends do continue. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Pete. Next up is Nicole Price.
Hello, thank you. Actually, it says that Glenn is next.
A little bit of a glitch there. Glenn, do you mind picking up and jumping in here so we get the order of the slides right?
Sure. Hello, My name is Glenn Kaler. I'm University of Maine Cooperative Extension Associate Scientist for Integrated Pest Management. I work primarily with tree fruit. I'm going to first slide here. So warming brings both benefits and costs for agriculture. Historically, Maine temperatures have been on the cool side for optimum crop production. Warming has different aspects, one of which is the average annual minimum temperature that is used to define the USDA plant hardiness zones. And that's what this slide is showing here. The average annual minimum temperatures have already moved upward in Maine, and future projections show the continued warming for the coming decades. Those cold winter temperatures act as a filter on which perennial plants will do well in Maine and which will not survive due to winter mortality. It also has a strong effect on which insect, disease, and weed pest species can overwinter in Maine. So as that filter gets easier to pass, we will get more pest problems, but it opens up some opportunities for perennial crops. Next slide, please. Another impact of warming is for Maine to shift to longer and warmer growing seasons. This has advantages for opening up more annual and perennial crop options, as well as impacts on livestock production, mostly favorable, though it does bring more risk of heat stress and some other negative temperature impacts. But climate change is not just temperature, and it is not just smooth and incremental. This slide shows the lengthening growing seasons, and I just circled Lewiston and Presque Isle there as two iconic representations for southern Maine and northern Maine. Next slide, please. So that's basically good news. I mean, globally, climate change is negative on agriculture, but Maine, being a cool state, overall, you would think it would have a beneficial impact, and in fact, it may. However, so far, it has not. What we see is temperature variability becoming a major issue. So one example was in 2023, we had an early warm February and March, which caused apple trees to bud development to progress. And then we had a late freeze, which either killed flowers outright, so you wouldn't even see an apple, or resulted in a lot of apples being scarred by frost rings, which made them unsaleable. So that's an example of temperature variability. Next slide, please. And here's an example of precipitation variability, which Sean Burkle already alluded to. The 2020 June 1st through September 30th growing season had extremely low rainfall, and this generated a lot of concern and needs and stress for crop production running out of water, need for irrigation. As Sean mentioned, there was a drought disaster declared. But then in 2023, the faucet turned on and we had just the opposite, and it seemed like it wouldn't stop raining. And this made it difficult or impossible in some cases for farmers to get onto their fields to plant crops. And it also had a strong negative impact on the ability to get to cut and dry hay before it rots on the ground. And you can't bale it when it's wet. It has to be dried. And of course, it increased flooding and soil erosion, and also fertilizer and seed runoff losses. Next slide, please. So those are some of the impacts. Changing our focus to Maine's agricultural contributions to greenhouse gas emissions, we see that livestock agriculture outweighs crop production. In fact, carbon dioxide is the minimal from Maine agriculture. The greenhouse gases of concern are methane and nitrous oxide. So this chart breaks down agricultural greenhouse gas emissions into 4 categories, 3 of which are exclusive to livestock. So on the bottom there in the red is enteric methane. This refers to methane generated by ruminant digestion, basically cows burping. The next one up there is manure, which is another major source of methane. The blue section is soil nitrous oxide, which basically comes from fertilizer application, crop residue, and nitrogen fixing plants such as clover, beans, and other legumes. And then the top bars there, the light blue, that's nitrous oxide coming from manure. Again, another livestock source. Next slide, please. And this slide just breaks down how the Maine's agricultural greenhouse gas contributions segregate out between livestock only and other ag sources, with a little more detail on what those sources are. Again, we see methane from digestion, methane from manure, nitrous oxide from manure, and then soil nitrous oxide from manure. And then the other ones are from fertilizer and nitrogen fixing plants and crop residue. Next slide, please. And this is the last slide. It's just important to remember that more than half of greenhouse gas emissions related to food occur off the farm and after the farm. And unfortunately, at the end of that supply line process, over 30% of food, according to USDA national estimates, we don't have Maine specific estimates, but over 30% of food after generating those greenhouse gas emissions gets wasted, so those emissions serve no useful purpose. So reducing food waste is a major focus area. And that's my final slide.
Thanks, Glenn. That's wonderful. Looks like we have Nicole's slides here. So Nicole, thanks for your patience. You're up now.
No worries. Thank you very much. I just introduced myself quickly. My name is Nicole Price. I'm a senior research scientist at the Bigelow Lab for Ocean Sciences in East Booth Bay. And go ahead to the next slide, please. So in addition to the very palpable extreme storm-related issues that coastal Maine has been experiencing the past few months and weeks, and that Peter had just reviewed previously, an important recent development for coastal and marine ecosystems in Maine are the updated projections for the coming decades of seawater warming and the rate of ocean acidification, particularly focused in our Gulf, where these changes are more rapid than elsewhere in the world. Two significant recent efforts or publications using multiple modeling approaches and scenarios each project that warming and acidification rates are accelerating relative to what the Science and Tech Subcommittee reported in 2020. And each of these efforts have started an agreement across the models that were used. Of particular note is that ocean acidification will place our very vulnerable shellfish species in conditions that are not conducive to shell growth for most of the year by 2050. This is a direct threat to our fisheries and ecosystem function in general. Next slide, please. Impacts are also becoming more and more evident at higher trophic levels as well, like in marine mammals. I think we are all familiar with the dwindling population issues of the North Atlantic right whale, and these elevated mortality rates and shifts in population distributions in recent decades are increasingly linked directly with warming in the Gulf of Maine and indirectly with reductions in prey availability, also driven by climate change. In fact, this linkage between the prey and the predator, the whale in this case, is so evident that recent models have been developed to predict where copa populations will be distributed and in what abundances in future years, and are now being used to develop management strategies for these at-risk whale populations. Next slide, please. Shifted copepod distributions and lower abundances driven by warming waters and related issues are also implicated as one factor in the myriad responsible for reduced landings in the lobster industry in recent years, a predicted climate impact trend that is unfortunately coming to fruition. Recent evidence demonstrates that a mismatch in the emergence of larval lobsters, particularly the laying of the eggs, and the availability of the copepods as prey for the later larval stages may be partially responsible for failing appearance of younger lobster generations. While other commercially important subpolar species continue to experience local reductions along our coastlines, other opportunistic temperate marine species are becoming more abundant. The extent to which Maine is prepared to capitalize on these new emergent fisheries depends on continued scientific, biological, and physical monitoring to understand when they are ready for us to explore. Next slide, please. Likewise, the long-term sustainability of our nascent aquaculture industries will depend upon our ability to rebuild working waterfront infrastructure that is prepared to withstand the storm damage we should come to expect, and weather extremes, and to prepare for the impacts for frequent and more intense marine heat wave events. Recent work has projected that we should anticipate conditions more conducive to harmful algal blooms, as depicted on the left bottom graph, that impact the bottom line of shell fisheries. And then these same heat waves will create conditions less conducive to wild kelp populations on the right. And the provision of the important brood stock required each late summer to initiate the nurseries and hatcheries, depicted in the bottom picture by the dark shaded area of the kelp. That's the source tissue, and that is becoming less available to start our kelp nurseries and hatcheries with our warmer summer waters. Next slide, please. But increasingly, we are looking to coastal oceans as a possible opportunity to help mitigate climate-driven challenges. I want to end this marine section by mentioning two possibilities that are under exploration in our state, with a recent influx of private and federal funding to explore research and development for each of these, results of which we plan to continue to report on in the future, coming out of the Science and Tech Subcommittee. First is the possibility of accounting for and enhancing carbon burial and storage in our ocean systems. We need to develop more tools to measure, report, and verify these processes, should they exist. Finally, and the second is offshore wind power as a renewable energy source. There's a lot of work done that still needs to be done to establish baselines and understand impacts of these potential resources, renewable energy resources, but there's growing evidence that in some cases, they're less impactful than initially feared, but they need to be evaluated on a case-by-case basis. Finally, I want to acknowledge significant efforts that are underway to understand the carbon footprint of our fisheries and aquaculture in order to understand where efficiencies can be found, much like you just heard from Glenn in the land-based ag systems. And these reports will be released in the coming months. Thank you.
Thanks, Nicole. All right. In our tour across a lot of different terrain, we are now headed over to Kristen Perrier to talk about forests and biodiversity. So Kristen, you're up next.
All right, now I can see myself. Thank you, David. Hi, I'm Kristen Perrier. I'm an ecologist with the Maine Natural Areas Program, which is part of the Department of Agriculture, Conservation, and Forestry. And I'll be presenting on two subgroups today, both forests and biodiversity. Next slide, please. Starting off with measurements of Maine's forest carbon, Maine's forests and harvested wood products together sequester more than 15 million metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent per year. This is equivalent to nearly all of Maine's annual fossil fuel greenhouse gas emissions. We have had persistently high rates of carbon sequestration over the past 10 years, but emerging threats of climate change, such as tree pests and disease, could reverse this trend. Next slide, please. Numerous emerging threats, particularly invasive species and extreme weather events, will likely influence the future structure and composition of Maine's forests. In the last decade, the forest has become increasingly dense, as you can see in the graph, the maps on the right, which increases natural mortality and decreases resilience due to higher tree stress. Climate change may accelerate these trends further. Next, please. Maine has had relatively low forest fire risk. Historically, though, catastrophic wildfires have occurred, particularly under dry conditions. As you heard referenced earlier, for air quality concerns, the 2023 Nova Scotia fires burned forests that are similar to those found in Maine. And projections indicate an increase in wildfire-prone indicators for Maine. While Maine's wildfire risk will remain low compared to the West, it is still vulnerable due to high forest fuel loads, residences located in the forest interface, and limited wildfire fighting infrastructure. Next, please. Maine's forest managers are increasingly requesting assistance for cost-effective climate change mitigation and adaptation strategies. Objectives and perceptions vary across stakeholders as well, and forest management is, of course, complex. Key concerns include warming winters, extreme weather, declining tree vigor, and storm-damaged tree hazards. While adaptation is often a priority, managers face barriers such as harvest opposition, high costs, limited timber markets, and lack of information at relevant spatial scales. Finally, gaps exist with translating available science to on-the-ground management. Next, please. Okay, the next 3 slides move beyond just forests to biological diversity in general. So climate change is having a profound effect on the status of biota worldwide, with increasing evidence of species movement or loss due directly to climate change. Also, there are mounting predictions as to how changing climatic factors such as temperatures, storm severity, and precipitation will undermine habitat requirements or even compound these issues with seasonal mismatches, breaks to food webs, new diseases, parasites, and invasive species. In Maine, for example, 8 wildlife species were recently added to Maine's list of endangered and threatened species, many of which are additions driven in full or part by climate change, such as the salt marsh sparrow and the high elevation dweller, Bicknell's thrush. Next, please. Over the last 125 years, there have been many more extinctions due to habitat loss than due to climate change. However, it is expected that this trend will shift, and climate will contribute both more directly and more immediately to extinctions in the future. Species likely to be most vulnerable to the compounding stress of climate change are those that may already be listed in the state as rare, or have narrow or specialized habitat needs, such as a spring salamander or the wood turtle. And in the Northeast, models also suggest that population sizes and range of many common and culturally important species will decrease as well, such as ruffed grouse, black-capped chickadee, moose, black spruce, and balsam fir. Eastern brook trout and other cold water fish are projected to decline significantly across their range, although Maine is also predicted to be a regional stronghold for brook trout if suitable cold water habitats are maintained. Next, please. Finally, geological and physical diversity across landscapes are the underpinnings of species diversity. In addition, research over the past 3 decades by state biologists has contributed to the knowledge that there are discrete areas of the Maine landscape where a disproportionate concentration of at-risk species and habitats are located. Recognizing and protecting nature's stage, along with focus areas of statewide ecological significance, are strategies that can help increase the viability of species and support adaptation and resiliency as climate changes. And the final point I'll make here is that biodiversity protection yields nature-based solutions. Land management, restoration, and protection measures that reconnect streams and tidal rivers, anticipate sea level rise and marsh migration, and preserve large blocks of connected habitat, as well as high biodiversity habitats, such as old forests and riparian areas, will also pay out in carbon storage, greenhouse gas mitigation, floodwater abatement, water quality, and more. Thank you.
Thanks, Kristen. Wonderful. All right, we've got 2 more, folks. We've got our state geologist, Steve Dixon's up next. And then we'll finish up with Susie. So Steve, you're up next if we can get you spotlighted. Let's give it just a second. There you are.
Thank you, David. It's a pleasure to be here and joining this group. I'm a co-chair of the STS and the state geologist with the Maine Geological Survey in the Department of Agriculture, Conservation, and Forestry. And what I'm going to go over here quickly are just some of the needs that are being developed. And so if you ask a scientist what needs to be studied, you better be ready for a long answer. I mean, they're going to get plenty from 40 scientists on STS. And so what we've produced here is going to be a real short overview of what will be included in an appendix in the STS report coming out next month. The needs we describe are really based on science and many are forward-looking. As you can see, we've been using past trends going forward. Monitoring is not always flashy, but it's essential really to finding trends and finding solutions. So just think back, if we didn't have temperature data for more than the last 10 years, how would we know how to go forward? Next slide, please. First, let's focus on agriculture in the land and air realm. Interpreting weather forecasts is really important, as Glenn was saying, to support decisions by the growers. The agricultural sector needs new tools or better tools for farm management, better understanding local degree days, dealing with pest emergence, fungal disease, harvesting, hay, things like that. In addition, site-specific trends in the duration of the growing season really matter. Timing of the first and the last frosts. And those are going to change in different places in Maine over time. Biodiversity is extremely important. As Kristen was saying, we also need to understand how invasive species are moving. As it sounds, they're invasive, they're on the move here in Maine. We need to know which way they're going and what their population distributions are. We need to understand the range of ticks and their population density and really how that affects endangered and threatened species. And we need to map forest changes. Forests themselves are projected to change, and so we need to map those out, both trends and into the future, for their health, their biomass, tree carbon, soil carbon, and integrate all that information together. And we need to begin including indigenous knowledge in these assessments of the biome. In the world of climate, as we've seen both in Sean's presentation and Pete's, the study of high impact storms and trends is very important. So we've seen this variability in the climate change. We need to get a really good handle statistically and quantitatively on those. We need to also look at real-time hydrology, drought monitoring. For example, the flash floods and the flash droughts. Even just a few years ago, flash droughts wasn't really a common term. We also need to track solar irradiation and clouds for things related to the biosphere, but also related to photovoltaics. And lastly, we need to work with air monitoring statewide for particulate matter, ozone, pollen, not just in the most dense parts of the state, but across the whole region in places where the population isn't as dense or is capable of adapting. Next slide, please. In the realm of water, we have seen and heard and know harmful algal blooms are extremely important. So we need to develop faster toxin sensing. We need to understand bioaccumulation of the toxins going up the food chain, and we need to connect the biotoxins to human health. So there are a lot of linkages there and allow us to also put out advisories. We need to expand the stations and the data types to be more comprehensive across the state of Maine in terms of water quality. In hydrology, wetland hydrology and water balance is extremely important. This matters for multiple sectors. As Kristen was suggesting too, it's all an integrated system. We need to expand the stream gauge network and snowpack monitoring. As we've seen, each year can be extremely different than the last. And we need to improve detailed river flood forecasting and mapping for real-time advisories and also for assessing future risk. And in the marine environment, we need better local monitoring of deep water temperatures. We have a good understanding of the surface temperature changes, but very little about the deeper water. And of course, this is a three-dimensional system, and we need to understand it for ecological and fisheries consequences. Coastal nutrient loads are also important. That leads to things like lower oxygen in the marine realm. We have to examine the marine harmful algal blooms and the bacteria and the trends there. We need to expand the water level sensor network and model future erosion from sea level rise. We need to improve the guidance on storm preparedness and coastal adaptation. And lastly, the next slide, we turn to the human dimension sector. And as we heard from previous speakers, we need to address the mental health from extreme physical conditions. It's more than heat stroke and hypothermia. It also includes anxiety. We need to go over and prepare for the inability of some to adapt. That burden falls more heavily on some than in others. And we need to work on the loss of cultural heritage, including a sense of place that's so important here in Maine. We need to develop public health interventions and care, particularly for the most vulnerable. We need to project climate migration and tourism, including external drivers. We need to relate that to the demographics that will come and stressors on housing, transportation, the power grid, and economics. And we need to really look at the population vulnerability and readiness across the whole state in terms of both the socioeconomics and infrastructure. We also need to understand ticks and pathogens, even though most of us would rather not know. So those are my final points, and I will just say that we have plenty of information in the assessment coming, and we'll have a lot more in the needs category to go forward from here and provide that advice. So with that, I'll come back to you, David. Thank you.
Thanks, Steve. Really great. A lot of needs, but it's helpful to have the focus. And thank goodness we have Susie Arnold to finish this off with the science of hope. There's a lot of heavy stuff we've just been listening to. Let's get Susie in to have a really interesting presentation about how to not lose hope in the face of a lot of threat. So Susie, over to you.
Thanks, David. Hello, everybody. My name is Susie Arnold. I'm the Senior Ocean Scientist at the Island Institute, where I also direct our Center for Climate and Community. And of note, much of this closing presentation is actually not part of our assessment. So as a co-chair of the Scientific and Technical Subcommittee, I'm often asked to give presentations like we've just seen on the impacts of climate change, on the things that we love and that we value. And in the question and answer time, probably the question that I receive the most is this: in the face of all this bad news, what gives you hope? So participating in events like what is pictured here on this slide give me hope. This was a Talk of the Towns event on climate resilience organized by town leaders in Stonington. And I was lucky enough to be invited to participate on this panel with some folks that you might recognize from the Climate Council process. There's Kathleen Billings, the town manager of Stonington, Carla Gunther from the Maine Center for Coastal Fisheries, Carl Wilson from the Maine Department of Marine Resources, amongst others. There's also an auditorium packed full of engaged people, all interested in taking action on climate to preserve the things that they value in their town. So I left this event feeling even more motivated to take action. So just a real quick story about why me, a marine biologist, is talking about the science of hope. Back in 2022, or coming out of the pandemic, there were additional right whale rules looming over the lobster fishery. And fishery-dependent community members were practically in tears hearing about all of the climate-induced and other challenges facing their communities. At this point, I knew I had to change something about how I was communicating climate science. I had recently participated in a staff training where we were introduced to the science of hope. And since then, seeing the urgent need for hope, I've done some more digging. So next slide, please. It turns out that hope is more than a feeling. Just as we can measure changes in climate variables, scientists also measure hope, and they've been doing so for about 30 years. Hope can be taught, it can be learned, and importantly, it can be restored. It's about three primary components: goal setting, agency thinking, and pathways thinking. Importantly, hope is more than optimism. It's about taking action. So without the pathways thinking, it's simply wishful thinking. So to break it down a little bit further, you have to have a meaningful goal. You have to have agency, which is the knowledge or the determination that gives you the confidence that you can achieve your goal. And you have to have pathways thinking. Do you have a plan and a willingness to tweak your plan? Next slide, please. So earlier this morning, we heard from Rebecca Lincoln and now just Steve Dixon as well, highlighting concerns around climate anxiety. Climate anxiety has been shown to lead to both action and paralysis. Importantly, hope has been shown to increase climate action more than anxiety. Hence, a real need to promote feelings of constructive hope in communications to encourage climate action. Particularly with youth, so high school age or older, who have the intellectual capacity to kind of grapple with the consequences of climate change and who also may be experiencing climate anxiety, it's really important to coordinate openings for discussion, to supply opportunities to exercise agency, and avenues for meaningful action. Lastly, communication models that further engagement in climate conversations involve not just the head or an understanding of climate change, but also the heart and hands. So an opportunity to participate in action. The last publication shown here on this slide showcases a climate change communication toolkit that, amongst other strategies, pairs climate drivers with community-based solutions. Next slide, please. One of the single best predictors of hope is our connectedness with each other. So, meaning an important component to nurture hope is through social outlets, like showing up for presentations in your community or getting involved with local groups. These also build social capital or strong relationships, which make communities not just more resilient, but better situated for disaster preparedness and response. These types of engagements are also critical so that people see themselves in solutions. We can make recommendations and strategies, but without that interaction, it's really hard to know what it feels like to communities. Last slide, please. So in conclusion, hope is a framework for action. As I mentioned, there is a great distinction between hoping, which is all about action, and wishing, which is passive, having a desire to do something, but there's nothing we can really do. So I challenge us all going forward to be hope givers in our communications. I view my own role on the STS as an opportunity to build agency. The working groups help provide pathways for incremental action, and the council lays out the plan for meeting our collective goal, which is climate action. Thank you.
Susie, thank you so much for that. And what a great way to end. Let's go ahead and drop the slides. Yeah, wonderful. Okay. So that was a little more than an hour of a ton of information, ending on a spirit of hope, which was great. We have about 10 minutes or so, maybe even a little bit more, for you all as climate counselors to reflect on this. We'd be interested to hear, what is this making you think, right? As you hear this whole array of the best science we have to date around climate. And if you have questions for this pretty impressive group of scientists here, this is a good time to do some of those questions too. So I'm just going to open it up. And I guess my first question is, what does this make you think as a climate council, having just done an hour of key scientific points of view on this? What's going through your heads right now? Don't be shy. Dr. Va?
Why not, right? By the way, I really appreciate everyone's presentation today and just all the thought and work and intention that went into them. And I love ending on hope. With that being said, just some things I was thinking about, because I know we opened up with, what is that human impact, right? And I think in some ways, some of the work is really obvious. In other ways, it wasn't. I think it took several steps in thinking to think about the potential human impact, but it didn't come out immediately. It just took some drilling down. And I'm wondering if that's something that we as a team can try to do if we think about public health or public messaging, right? Because I did hear from some of the working groups just that, populations, living communities, how does this feel relevant to them right now? It's just something to think about. In addition to that, I couldn't help, I put my public health hat on, and with that last presentation about hope, right? Social connectedness, creating those opportunities to connect, to build that social network, social agency. I love that. And I had to think about how is that reflected in some of the work that Maine CDC does? And so I appreciate you guys bringing that to the table, and it allows me to bring that back to my team and think about could we do more here in terms of that level of messaging to our communities and to our youth? Thanks.
Thanks, Dr. Ball. And maybe it's part of climate action that you as a council want to say. Part of climate action is communicating that way. Yeah. Other things that are going through your heads as climate counselors as you experience this pass through the science? Careful, I'm gonna start calling on folks if we don't have a little.
I mean, David, I just want to, I really appreciate Dr. Vaugh's comments. And I mean, I think we're all grappling with so much of the substance of the presentation. And then to hear sort of Susie's, that's a real contrast, and sort of that is our role as the Maine Climate Council, is to come up with a plan and pathway that helps prepare our state and do our part to reduce the impacts that the scientists tell us will happen if we don't take action. But it really is I think we're all guilty of sort of some of the doom that Susie describes, because we're feeling it, and we're feeling it in our communities. And I guess I'm thinking about some of the very specific things, and I won't call in anybody either, but I think about fishermen grappling with very specific changes and consequences and what that means, or looking at Melissa and farmers. And I just think some power of understanding and then connecting it with strategies that we can take, and state agencies can take, and communities can take, that allow people to feel that some parts of this are manageable. That is obviously our whole task as a climate council. It's extremely challenging, and Michael Stoddard was just messaging me about the importance of some of this messaging, because we all can get very overwhelmed, but we are in this plan as we update it, really presenting the solutions, or the solutions that we know are viable in the state of Maine. So just want to really thank the STS for just, I think, doing this very in an incredibly helpful way. And I think we all look forward to the report itself, but I think your presentation just really help us think about this in a more thoughtful way. So I'll stop talking. There's a bunch of hands up.
Thanks, Hannah. Absolutely. Linda Silka, you are working with the council in trying to help organize conversations with a variety of communities across the state. Your hand's up. Go ahead, please.
Yes, what great talks. And I'd especially like to call out Susie Arnold and her talk. I'm a social and community psychologist, and there's so much work that's being done that is related to the important points that she raised, but needs to be brought out of the journals and into the action. And Susie, you just, I want to go to every social psychologist in the state, every student in the state, and tell them just how great your presentation was. Thank you.
Thanks, Linda. Nicole, did you want to jump in on some of this?
Yeah, just very briefly, I wanted to reflect on the term that Susie used, agency, and then how that relates to pathways. And in some cases, the solutions or the ideas that are being explored are going to require lots of people and large amounts of coordination. But there are other opportunities, smaller pathways that can be sought by individuals. And I guess I would love to see our committee work to identify where those smaller pathways are and where those larger opportunities are for people to join in, to make sure that everybody feels that sense of agency.
Nice. Thanks, Nicole. Kurt, were you spurred by Hannah's comment about fishermen?
Yeah, that got me itching to chime right in, but more from Susie's presentation. So thank you to both of you for that. And thanks to everyone for the great presentations this morning. Around hope, I think one of the things that has me most hopeful has happened over the last week or so. A friend of mine from Sorrento, Chuck Bennett, I wrangled him into joining our working group. He is a 30-year-old third-generation lobsterman. And over the past week, he's been exploring the ocean climate tool on the Niraku site. And he just happened to discover like the lowest salinity levels that we have seen throughout the Gulf of Maine on that site, and has sparked a conversation with Carl and Jess and Damian Brady from the University of Maine. They even have Dave Townsend roped into it now. And so I'm hopeful because of that. We're getting new people involved in the conversation, and they're asking the right questions. So really wonderful stuff, and that's where my hope lies right now.
Thanks, Kurt. That's a great story. Ken Colburn, go ahead, please.
Thank you, David. I too am appreciative of Susie's closing, but not least because I hope we all regard the sum of the presentations offered as kind of a line of demarcation. We are not fearing what will happen anymore. We are seeing what is happening. And so we can stop talking about what will happen, although it will get worse and worse, certainly, depending on our and the globe's action. But we are past the point of looking to the future only. It's here, it's now. We're seeing it as these presentations document. That, of course, reinforces Susie's conclusions about the need for hope and action, the pathways and the efforts, the willingness and the ability. But it is no longer, as I say, a line of demarcation. It's no longer in preparation for, it's in response to. Thanks.
Thanks, Ken. Yep. The numbers are showing it for sure. Other reflections, what's on people's minds, things that jumped out at you as you heard the range of information that was presented? I'm curious, for instance, like from a municipal standpoint, and Gary, I don't want to pick on you, but just when you saw all that information and you're thinking, how is this most relevant for towns across Maine? Like, what was going through your head from where you sit?
Yeah, I'm a realist. I'm with Ken. It's happening here and now. I think, remember, we are the species on this earth that a long time ago thought the earth was flat. And somebody who's a former wildlife biologist for the state and a municipal planner, I'm always trying to think 50 years down the road for what this community attribute infrastructure is going to be able to do. And I'm more interested in the energy working group, I guess, but things hit home pretty well here today. And what are we forgetting in terms of society, faith communities, other aspects that can be very positive in people's lives when climate change things may make you very anxious, especially considering on the coast and how hard they got hit. But I think we need to look at what we're not doing. I'm all in favor of going solar and wind, but we seem to be pushing nuclear and natural gas out to the side for obvious reasons. They have problems, but I wonder if we should do that as hard as we are right now. And I'm still fairly new to the group here. I love going wind and solar, but I guess the what ifs if those don't produce over the next 20 years.
Thanks,
Sorry
Gary.
to be pessimistic.
It's all right. It's all good. I'm curious. I'm just looking around the screen here right now. Melissa Law, there was a fair amount of information about the growing season and changes there. I'm curious, Melissa, again, sorry to put you on the spot, but when you were hearing the presentations, you're thinking about what you're seeing on yourself. What's going through your head, Melissa, looking at all this scientific information?
Yeah, I mean, the slide that kind of jumps to mind, I forget the exact title, but I think it was like A Tale of Two Seasons or A Tale of 2 Years from Glenn's presentation. And just the differences we're experiencing, not necessarily like the growing season getting longer quite yet, but just from season to season and the huge divergence between seasons with drought and then looking at last year and how extremely wet it was. Yeah, this slide really was the one that kind of captured my experience as a farmer, and just how difficult it is to prepare for both of these at the same time. And frankly, to not just from the growing perspective, but also from the business perspective. And I feel that a lot of the farms and fisher and, fishing businesses are just struggling to stay in business because the impacts of these two polar opposite experiences are having a really huge impact on the financial sustainability of our businesses and being able to plan for it. So that's what we're experiencing.
Thanks, Melissa. Yeah, very daunting. Any final
And
reflections? Oh, go ahead, Hannah. Yeah, sorry.
No, and I just think, I think the folks on this call, we have, many visitors, I'm sure, joining us as well, but are, other than the two subcommittees, are the working groups who are currently trying to come up with solutions and updates for our climate plan. And I think that, I kind of reflect on what Melissa is saying and Kurt's comments. Our challenge now, and sort of, I think the charge is that the STS is presenting us with facts, some predictions of where we are, and our job is to come up with the tools to help Maine people navigate. And I know that's the work that some of the working groups are considering. I think we think a lot about communities and how they're navigating and what information and policies and other tools we can give them. I think the same is true of folks working in natural resource industries. And that kind of gets back to the hope, or just the realistic notion of how we help manage. So Melissa, I just think your comments are helpful. And I don't know, I know Amanda Beal was somewhere out there. I don't know if there's a perfect solution that we can devise, but clearly we need to have tools that help people respond to what they are experiencing. And that is, especially those extremes, there's going to be no perfect tool, but at least that is the charge of our working groups, is to understand where we are, consider this science, and then help people determine how we're going to navigate it, at least the way in which we're experiencing it and predicted to experience it. So I think your comments are really helpful in helping to ground us in that. That is our job as a climate council.
Thanks, Hannah. I think out there in the among attendants is one of our co-chairs, Carl Wilson. And Carl, were you trying to jump in here? I think Molly's got you set up so you could contribute.
No, I was just coming off the road and coming more into presence and participating. So nothing specific to say, David. Thank you.
Thanks, Carl. Okay. All right. Speaking of promoting folks, and we're going to take a break now. And I want to thank, before we do, there's two things I want to say. One is what you just saw for the last hour of presentations took an enormous amount of work. So I really want to thank each of those presenters and the teams associated with them in getting that together. Hannah and Melanie can explain exactly the timing on when that report comes out. I heard late April is a rumor. So stay tuned for that. The slides will be posted immediately after we finish our meeting here. So you can look for those online and have all that information online. So thanks to all of those members of our Science and Technical Subcommittee for the hard work. The second thing I want to say is while we are doing our break, we are going to be bringing all of the working group members who have been attendees in this webinar so far, and we're going to bring you right up here as panelists because we want you to be part of this next workshop, the Climate Impacts Workshop that's going to happen after we get back from our break. So be prepared to say yes to your panelist invitation. If you're a working group member, you should be getting that as we're having the break now. Let's take 10 minutes. We'll be back at 20 of, and we'll get into the second half of our meeting, which is an impacts workshop with a team that's associated with the Mitchell Center that's doing some of the work with the Climate Council around talking to different populations across the state. So thanks, everyone. Really interesting conversation on the back end of the presentations. We'll see you back here in a little less than 10 minutes. Feel free to turn off your camera while we wait here. Okay. Hannah, I'm going to turn it back to you to introduce this next section and why the council is embarking on it.
Great. Thank you, David, and welcome back, everyone. So the next portion of our Climate Council meeting, the next hour and a half, is going to be what we're calling a workshop. And I will just acknowledge that a Zoom workshop is incredibly challenging. So I really appreciate the efforts of the University of Maine, who will be here aiding us in walking through, I would say, a variety of activities to help us think about climate impacts and especially equity. And they will give us a lot more detail and I think food for thought. And the whole, I would say, reason for doing this is all of the working groups, I think, as I've said a couple of times, are currently working on updates to the plan and solutions. And I think as we learned from the scientists this morning, we as a state are continuing to see adverse climate impacts. And what we understand is those climate impacts are not equally felt across all of our state's population. So when it comes to state policies, especially when it comes to state funding, ensuring that the benefits of climate action can be taken by folks across all parts of our state, across multiple types of socioeconomic groups. I mean, that is the reason why we're doing this work. So I will just say the equity subcommittee and the leadership of the 5 leaders who are helping to lead this work are going to kick it off. I just want to provide, one example, because I just want to be very clear that I know that so many state leaders and communities and others are thinking thoughtfully about this. We put a lot of effort into this in our first climate plan, but we know that we can do a much better job. And through funding from the Environmental Protection Agency, through work being done across the Climate Council, we are working with Maine and others to ensure that we really engage not on just what we think are strategies that will accomplish equitable climate solutions, but we actually ask people in their own community, especially those who are, I think, least able to participate in the kind of public processes like this Zoom meeting, what they think and what they know will make a difference. So just one example, I will say just last week, the state announced Efficiency Maine, Maine Housing, the governor's energy office, and the governor announced a $10 million grant to pilot the use of a specific type of heat pump in low-income mobile homes in the state of Maine. And I know everyone is sick of hearing all of us in Maine talk about heat pumps. We're doing a great job, so we like to use this example. But a climate solution that saves people money, provides affordable air conditioning in increasingly warm summers, gets oil barrels out of basements and out of outsides where they tip over and Melanie and the DEP crew need to go clean them up. It's a solution that makes a big difference, but we know that not everybody can access the solution due to new technology, due to the cost. So a $10 million grant to really demonstrate what's possible and help figure out how to bring the cost down. One of the many exciting things happening, and I think what we're trying to think about today is how we can do a lot more of that across all of our work, both on resilience and on reducing emissions. So I will just pass it off to, I think, both Dr. Va and Amara Fiji, who are 2 of our rock star leaders of the equity work, to help open this up. And then we're going to pass it off to the University of Maine, who is going to walk us through the presentation.
Hi, thank you guys. Thank you so much, Director Pingree. Good morning, and thank you everybody and to the folks here for the invitation. I hope you guys hear me okay. You guys hear me okay?
Yes, you're
Okay, good. Just checking. But thank you so much for this invitation to say a few words about why today's workshop on climate impacts is so important. For those who don't know me, I am Dr. Va. I am the director for Maine CDC, in addition to being a member of the Climate Council. I'm joined this morning by Amara Fiji, also a member of the council, who works for the Maine Environmental Education Association. Together with Ambassador Molly and Bryant, Noel Bonham, and Gabrielle Alcade, we make up a 5-member leadership team for the Climate Council's Equity Subcommittee. One of the forces that drives our work of the Maine Climate Council and of this Equity Subcommittee is to ensure engagement in the climate planning process with diverse populations across Maine. I do want to make a special, not shout out, but to highlight, tribal engagement is really important. And I want to recognize that Ambassador Bryant isn't here with us today. She had a loss in her family, and we as a team, as a community, send our condolences. But in her absence, we will continue to work closely with the ambassador to ensure that there is robust tribal engagement as part of this Maine Climate Council's work and with her leadership. Now, with that being said, our workshop today builds upon what was discussed already in the first 1.5 hours, that human impact, and on the prior work of the subcommittee, which was established just after the release of Maine Won't Wait in 2020. And builds upon the work that as working together over the next 2 years to develop recommendations which center vulnerable communities in the state's climate planning and action. These recommendations include actions to ensure that the benefits of Maine's climate actions reach those who need it most, which is the focus of today's workshop. I'm going to hand this off to Amara.
And I'm just making sure Amara, there you are.
Awesome. Hi, everyone. Thanks, Dr. Ba. Like Dr. Ba said, my name is Amari Fiji, and I'm a part of the 5-member equity leadership team, also part of the larger Climate Council as well. It is really important, as been said before, that we ensure that benefits of Maine's climate actions reach all those who need it, especially vulnerable populations, because climate change will affect everyone. It is already affecting everyone in such profound ways. It creates really significant hardships for people in communities in more vulnerable positions in society, especially low-income residents, older adults, Indigenous folks, people of color, and others who face systemic challenges that often prevent them from being able to respond to climatic changes. We are already seeing the significant impacts of more frequent storm events, as been mentioned this morning by the STS. And this is something we're noticing in our neighborhoods, communities, and ecosystems. Maine has a really critical opportunity and a responsibility to help our communities take action. And we must work together to ensure that strategies to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and prepare for the impacts of climate change benefit all people in Maine, especially those most vulnerable. We support the integration of this equitable approach to climate change into the work of the Climate Council and each of our working groups. Dr. Ball, I'll pass it back to you.
Thanks, Samara. And I just want to underscore, I recognize that a lot of this, the topics of this discussion, equity and resilience, has already been discussed in the different work groups and in the work that you're already doing. What we're hoping to achieve with this work session is, well, in addition to that, in addition to the work that's already been done, in a collective discussion, can we shift our lens enough or even slightly or incrementally to look at it slightly differently and to think about things that we may have not considered, but someone else might consider. And what I mean by that is this workshop will help us consider what equity and resilience means to different people based on their lived experience, and what equitable policy responses might look like that consider those important differences. I can tell you this, in a conversation just in a group of subject matter experts in public health, when you talk about equity, when you talk about resiliency, it's fascinating the stories and the differences in the stories that folks bring to the table and how they view equity and resiliency. I'm hoping that this workshop will help us appreciate those different ways that climate change has direct and indirect consequences for different populations and how it impacts different people differently. This is also true for the well-meaning climate change policies that can have unintended consequences on certain impacted populations or communities, which was mentioned earlier. We are encouraging folks on this call during this workshop. We are encouraging you to keep this in mind throughout today's workshop. Thanks. Amara?
Thank you. So for today's workshop, we're also going to have the opportunity to recognize that different people in the same community might be disproportionately impacted differently by the same event or trend caused by climate change. And that different communities may understand the complex relationships between climate change and other systemic challenges, like, for instance, housing affordability differently. And communities can have different beliefs, values, and behaviors around climate change, regardless of their exposure to climate risk. I think that just really speaks to the fact that when we think about climate change and we're thinking about a state climate action plan, yes, we want something that everyone can see themselves in, and also holding that balance of a community-centered approach, because a community knows how they're being impacted by these issues. Finally, in addition to increasing awareness about the constructive frameworks of equity and resilience and becoming more inclusive in our climate change planning process, today's workshop will provide a framework to help us co-create infrastructure within the Climate Council that is thoughtful, honest, creative, assertive, and sustainable, and to identify the type of ongoing support that we and the communities we serve, of course, need to further our equity, climate change, and resilience goals. Thank you all so much. We're really excited for this workshop. And with that, I think I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to Kihara.
Mara, thanks so much. Dr. Mara, I really appreciate those opening remarks. And we're thrilled to be presenting to you today. I wanted to introduce myself and my colleague, Mo, we are the co-facilitators for today's event. So we're both connected with the University of Maine's Mitchell Center for Sustainability Solutions. I am a community engagement specialist and a researcher about civic issues, and much of my work centers on how to create more voice for underrepresented people in policy and important decisions. And Mo, I want to kick it over to you to introduce yourself as well.
Hi, everybody. I'm Mo Nunez. I've worked mostly in the education sector, mostly in public schools for the last 20 years. I'm currently working on my PhD in the School of Public Policy at the University of New Hampshire. And my work centers on diversity, equity, and inclusion, community and family engagement, and working with at-risk youth. And most of those are in public schools.
Great. And I think I'm going to skip the school slide because the equity subcommittee did such a great job of outlining what we're doing today. So Mo, I'll kick it to you to do this warm-up activity today. And for the Consensus Building Institute, we are gonna skip the first Menti prompt and go to the second Menti prompt just to give you some direction there. But Mo, why don't you warm us up here?
Yeah, sure. Let's think about a 20-mile radius from where you live, right? So think about your house and then like a circle that's 20 miles wide. And then think about how do you think climate change will impact your community? You know, what's going to change? What's going to be threatened? There's a link to the Mentimeter poll off to the side. And yeah, see if you can put down some thoughts on that, and we'll unpack them when we get some results.
Those of you who haven't used Menti before, I recommend using it on your cell phone because then you can participate in the poll, but watch the screen for the results. We're going to start pulling up the results in a moment, but you're also welcome to click that link and participate right on your laptop if that feels better to you.
Mm-hmm.
And CBI, I think in a moment we can start to watch those live results come in.
Mm-hmm. Nice, yeah. Okay. Right. Yeah, I'm going to go ahead and read a couple of these as they sort of come in. In Freeport, sea level rise and fishing Some people said overwhelming of wastewater and stormwater infrastructure, a worsening of the housing crisis. Absolutely, these are really spot on. Flooding, property damage, water quality impairments, pests, damages to crops. So as you could see, you know, people are answering differently from one another, but still thinking about, as it was mentioned earlier, right, the same thing, right, the climate impact. But as you can see, like it's doing different things in different places. The outcomes are different. Sea level rise and storm damage, immigration, risk of oil spills from oil tanks inside and outside of basements. Absolutely. Somebody got very specific. Higgins Beach will disappear. Yeah, that's great. Okay. So we'll just keep that up from 30 more seconds. Okay. Cool. All right. So we're going to ask a different question now. So some people in the state will be more vulnerable to climate change than others. Can we go back to the presentation?
Yeah, absolutely.
Oh, thank you. Okay. Okay. So some people in the state will be more vulnerable to climate change than others. What we want you to think about is what populations do you think could be more vulnerable to climate change in Maine? And we'd like to hear your answers again in the Menti poll. And this time what it's going to do is going to create a word cloud for us to be able to just see as a general group what the answers are that we've come up with, okay? So same idea, you have a poll there, a poll link, and we'll pop those up on the screen. Awesome. Very exciting.
One thing that's cool about the word cloud is if you see a word that resonates with you, if you write the same word, it'll get bigger. So it's almost like voting for that word.
Yeah. Yeah. It's fascinating to see these come in real time. So as these get bigger, because more answers are pouring in, what do you notice? What do you see that are the answers that just keep getting bigger? And I'm noticing some new ones too popping into the poll. Wow.
Yeah, it's interesting to me how low income is consistently at the center there.
Right, right. And coastal started off small and it keeps getting bigger and bigger. And the elderly is staying there as one of the bigger ones as well, along with farmers. Tribal and rural keeps sort of staying in the center there, which is really, really incredible. So as you look at the poll, one of the things we want you to be thinking about is who are the people that are not represented in this poll, right? So as I look, I'm not really just yet seeing anything about folks without reliable internet. That might be a group that is going to be affected in a very different way, right? So as we go along, we'd really like for y'all to be thinking about who are the underrepresented groups in the conversations about the impact of climate change. So I'm going to move on to the next slide. Kiara and I would like to share two resources with you here. The first one is the U.S. Climate Vulnerability Index. Not sure how many of you have seen this, but this is an interactive map. You can pick any state in the country and sort of zoom in on it. So right now it's zoomed in on Maine, and this tool can provide some helpful national comparisons to understand how Maine compares with other states. So when you unpack this, as Kehata and I did, for instance, right, you'll find out that Maine is one of the most vulnerable states in the nation when it comes to the quality and accessibility of housing in a community. So what that means is we're number 10 out of 51 states in terms of the risk factors, right? Another data point that stood out to us is we're also 8th in the nation when it comes to the number of adults diagnosed with long-term health conditions, right? So this is important when we think about how people are going to be able to bounce back from climate disasters where they may be cut off from medical care and technology. One that really stood out to us was this tool rates us number 1 in the nation in terms of vulnerability to storms. And what they're referring to there is the number of hurricanes, tornadoes, and winter storms each year. Kihara, do you want to share the other tool?
Yeah, absolutely. And if you haven't noticed in the chat, we're actually chatting these links. So this is an interactive website you can go out to and experiment with to see more about the data that Mo just referenced. But let me take you to the next slide. So Mo just shared how Maine compares to other states in terms of social vulnerability, but I'm going to share some resources about the level of vulnerability for communities within Maine. So you see here, a map of different communities in Maine, and how these different regions in Maine compare with each other. So you should see the links to this data again in the chat. These are really helpful reports to familiarize yourself with. And social vulnerability here is defined by a few factors. So it's defined by income and wealth and social class, race and ethnic identity, disability, housing, and transportation. And just to highlight a few facts from these reports, we see these red spots on the map here are the most vulnerable communities in the state, followed by yellow, which are the second most vulnerable. And these red communities are actually 67% more vulnerable than other communities in Maine. So that's really striking. And these red communities are expected to be the most challenged to prepare for and recover from climate-related hazards. So the reports and the website that Mo shared on the last slide are really helpful if you want to learn more about social vulnerability in Maine. So we really just wanted to orient you to this resource.
Awesome.
And now we're going to look at comparing climate impacts for different people. And I'll kick this back to you, Mo.
Yeah. So we're going to do a little bit of photo analysis here. So I'm going to show you 2 photos, okay? And this is the first one. I want you to take a look at this photo, give you about, let's say, 20 seconds or so. Just what do you notice? What do you see in this picture? What could you infer in this picture? All right. So I'll share with you some of the things I see in this picture. So I love clothes. I love fashion. I immediately was drawn to his jacket. That's a pretty fancy jacket that he's wearing there. I love music, and I noticed that he's holding some sort of maybe iPhone headphone situation there. He seems to be protecting himself from the climate. And he looks to be, middle-aged, upper middle-aged, So I'm going to switch to another picture. Okay. So same thing. Take a look at this picture. Take about 30 seconds for this picture. Okay. Tell me what you see. All right. So here, I'm guessing that this woman is older than the man we saw in the other picture. I'm wondering if maybe this clutching thing is due to not being able to breathe because of the smoke. There's a house in the background that's on fire. That might be her house. So just kind of paying attention to what is it that you see here, right? And so next slide, Kihara. Now, what's really interesting is when we start to put multiple identities together to unpack the vulnerability, right? So let's go back to the woman, right? So there are a couple of things that we know about this woman. We know that she's older, right? And I said, she may be having health compromised, right? So let's say she does, that her health is compromised, right? And so what if she had mobility issues? What if she was also from a lower income background, right? So she doesn't have the resources to call someone to maybe come and helicopter her out of there, right? Or an emergency response team being able to have access to that, right? And what if she also doesn't speak English? And, what's that going to bring about, right? She's going to have trouble interacting with first responders, just to name something, right? That'll pop up. But when we continue to add factors like limited education, no partner, or no children to look out for her, you can see that the vulnerability, it keeps rising, And so what I want you to sort of focus on is the way that these overlap with each other in that Venn, right? That they compound the vulnerability. But when we think back to the man, if we add some of these factors back onto his identity, right? What if he's the one that can't speak English or he has health issues? How is that going to change his outcome during this event? So again, what we want you to think about is that these different combinations of our identity really matter when we're talking about the vulnerability of a place, of a person, of a community, or a culture. Kihara?
Thanks, Mo. So we want to build on what we just shared and explore how do these differences in vulnerability correspond to climate change impacts. So we're going to take you through an exercise where we share a scenario with you, and then we explore which populations in the state might be most impacted by this scenario. So we'll be using Menti again, and I'm also going to ask members of the Equity Subcommittee to help with this exercise. So let's start with our first scenario. Let's draw on something a lot of us have been experiencing lately, which is heavy rainstorms that leave many parts of the state flooded. In fact, in some places, entire roads are washed out, basements are flooded, etc. I bet this sounds familiar. You might have been dealing with this very recently. So now we'd like to hear from you. So we're going to turn to Mentimeter again, and we can share that link and code if people don't have it. So the question is, when heavy rains and flooding happen, what populations in the state do you think are going to be impacted the most or have the hardest time recovering? We know that flooding can impact everyone, but who do we need to be most concerned about? So we'd love to hear your thoughts on this. So we can switch for a second back to the Mentimeter poll and see what comes in here.
All right. Okay. Yeah. Yep.
So it's interesting, we did this in general at the beginning of the event today. And what's interesting is we're seeing some overlap and some different populations as well. So it's interesting to see rural growing larger. I think we're also seeing coastal and renters being larger.
Renters didn't play as big of an answer in the last one.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Children playing a big one there. Great. Yep.
And I'm seeing a lot, what's interesting with Menti is sometimes if people use slightly different language, the words don't get as large. But if I'm looking around, I'm seeing island communities working waterfront, like lots of references to waterfront. So we're gonna go back. Feel free to continue to participate in this because we're gonna come back to this poll. But I want to go back to the slides and bring you to a couple of photographs to kind of explore this issue a little bit more deeply. So I'm going to show you two photographs of real life experiences in Maine related to flooding. And let's think about the experiences of these people and of others who you think could be impacted by heavy rain and flooding. So this first photo is of a man in Naples. You can see that he has something in his hand and he's actually pulling a sled towards his car, which is on the other end of a flooded street so that he can carry in a newly purchased generator. So that is what he's dealing with. You can see his water boots on. We're presuming this is probably his home. So that is the first photograph. Just kind of take that in. then this is a second photograph. So this is a photograph of Hannaford and Gardner. Gardner and Hollowell experienced the worst flooding that they've had in nearly 40 years in a December storm. And the Gardner Hannaford is amazingly still not open. So it's not scheduled to open again until April. So right now people have to go to a grocery store in Randolph, which is across the bridge, or to larger cities like Augusta, which is about a 15-minute drive.
Yeah.
So I'd love to bring in some members of the equity subcommittee. So Gabe, I know you're prepared to talk about this. Dr. Vaughn and Rebecca, I know you didn't prepare this slide, but you're certainly welcome to jump into the conversation. Mo, if you have thoughts, you're also welcome to contribute, but maybe we'll start with Gabe. So I'd love to just engage in a little discussion about these flooding slides. And maybe we can start with the Menti poll, and we can pull up those results again to just kind of unpack a little bit more what you're seeing in that poll. And then I'd love to talk about these photographs and what you're seeing about how issues of equity, access, and inclusion play out in the photographs. So if we could pull up the Menti poll first. Gabe, I don't know if you want to start us out, just sharing any thoughts that you had as you were watching these results come in, and how you see that connect to broader equity and access issues in Maine.
Yeah, thanks so much, Kihara. I'm going to apologize to folks who responded to the Menti poll if I say something that's actually on here, because it's hard to read all of the smaller words. But I was just thinking, Mo, about something you had said earlier on about like internet access, and I think about that a lot too with our rural and like lower capacity communities, and thinking about how do people get information. So, it may be like, people without access to the way a community receives information. So if that's entirely via Wi-Fi, and this man, maybe he wasn't prepared, maybe he didn't have, a place to go to for a number of these reasons, maybe he's elderly, and the fact that he maybe doesn't have a lot of close family. So I think a lot of these words I was thinking of as well. But that was one thing, sort of geographic isolation in terms of and then access to resources in terms of information.
Yeah. It's interesting, Gabe, real quick, that geographic isolation piece, as soon as Kihara said, well, now it's a 15-minute drive, I was like, well, for somebody, it's now an hour-and-a-half drive. It just struck me as like, wow, that has to restructure your whole day now. Sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
I would probably also add, like, I completely agree with Gabe and what Mo just said. It's fascinating as I'm watching the Menti poll come in. One, there are many different populations, right? And when you look at them, it's interesting, some that come out more than others, like low income, elderly, but then there's children. And really all these populations face different challenges potentially, right? And their vulnerability may look different. And I think that's something to acknowledge. Gabe and Mo, you were speaking to isolation in terms of information and geographical isolation. But I think that also speaks to like folks with fewer community connections. In a few of those pictures, I saw folks just by themselves.
Yeah.
Right?
Wow.
Yep.
Yeah.
I was thinking the same thing, Dr. Va, especially going back to what Susie or Dr. Arnold was talking about in her presentation around the science of hope, and how that the counter to that is connection. And so just thinking about, a community as a whole, and then an individual's ability to be resilient, how connected are we? And then some people are more vulnerable because of these different indicators, factors that are making them more isolated and less connected.
Yeah.
I really appreciate this. I think probably some of you are familiar with the statistic that social isolation can be as deadly as smoking a pack of cigarettes a day. And we think of it oftentimes in terms of like depression and social connection and things like that. But I think when we're talking about climate, it's actually also like, who's coming to check on you if there's an emergency, right? Do you have a network of people who are actually looking out for you, or are you that cut off and isolated? So it's really relevant here. Rebecca, Dr. Va, Gabe, I'm curious if there's anything else as you looked at those photographs or as you're looking at this Menti poll that you wanted to highlight around equity, access, and inclusion in the state, maybe in particular around this issue of flooding. Like, what are you seeing here?
I'm not really sure how to phrase this, but one of the things that we've been talking about in the Community Resilience Working Group is around psychological resilience and preparedness for extreme weather events. And then once they happen, do you have what you need to respond? And I don't necessarily see that reflected in here, like the preparedness part. Like, do you believe that flooding can impact you? And so are you going to prepare for that? And I don't know how you could put that into a few words, but that is something that I'm just kind of processing right now with this particular section is just, there that is a factor. I just don't know what the like 2 or 3 words are that you would put into the Mentimeter, but that's something that's coming to mind for me right now.
That's interesting, Rebecca. I grew up in New York City, and this is the first and only house I've ever lived in here in Portland. I remember the first time my basement flooded, I was devastated. But my wife had grown up here, so she was like, all right, well, we need to do this. We need to do this. Oh, I can't believe we forgot this. Next time this happens, we're going to do these things. But I couldn't get past like, oh, my Lord, it's flooded down here. And it took me a while to kind of just come back down to baseline. So I'm glad that you said that because it was very real for me. That resilience, I needed to find it. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I'm going to add to that too. I'm so glad that Rebecca brought that up because you're absolutely correct. It's interesting. Like we talk about, I know in the public health world, we talk about often is a community, prepared to respond to something. And then, but drilling it down to the individual. I'm looking specifically at the elderly name in the Menti poll, just because like I think I came across some data element where it said something along the lines of, XX percentage of our, older Mainers didn't know where their warming centers were. And it speaks to, again, like, just being prepared and how to get that information out at the individual level.
Mm-hmm.
I just wanted to respond real quick to something I saw in the chat, which comes up often in the work that I do, which is a recognition among communities of how they don't feel necessarily that their social vulnerability index rating like truly reflects their community, or it seems to negate the fact that there are these very vulnerable populations within their community. So if they're like, well, we're low vulnerability, that's okay. No, it's like we have high socially vulnerable populations within our community, regardless of the fact that we are listed as a low or medium socially vulnerable community. So just thinking about that and wanting to go back and just say something around the connectedness piece and isolation, that something certainly, this is not going to be new, but like it seems almost like the smaller the community, the more connected folks are, and that may be considered like a very low capacity community in terms of like, how the municipality itself is able to share its preparedness information or resources to folks in the community. But there are oftentimes those social connections that can help people prepare. So it gets back to a lot of that intersectionality as well of like, yes, that it may be this and also this, but then there's this other factor that, maybe we are more connected than this other community might be. So I think it just takes a lot of thinking and truly sort of understanding the populations within your community. And as is seen here on the screen, every community likely covers all of this ground.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, this has been really great discussion. I wanted to show one more scenario and engage in a similar discussion. So I'm going to take us to extreme heat, which is another thing that we've been experiencing in Maine lately. Imagine this scenario coming up this summer. Maine has a heat wave of 95 to 100 degrees for over a week. Much of our infrastructure is not prepared to accommodate such hot weather. So we want to hear from you again, new Menti poll. And now let's think about the populations that might be impacted by extreme heat. And again, I think there may be some overlap, but I think we're going to have some new populations in here as well. So we'd love for you to go out to that poll. We can pull up the results again. And then we're going to show you a photograph of an extreme heat scenario.
Mm. Mm-hmm. Oh, wow.
What I find fascinating is just seeing some of the new
Yeah,
issues that
yeah, that's what I
that
was
come from a particular scenario, and that's why I think it's so helpful to take every climate impact case by case and think about who's impacted instead of assuming that it's the same groups every time, or even if it is the same groups, they may be impacted in different ways.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I'm seeing outdoor laborers and different versions of that term, different versions of unhoused, which I didn't see in any of the other ones before. Just unbelievable. Um, yeah.
And I'm also seeing some housing issues here, not having insulated houses, not having air conditioning, not having heat pumps.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So please keep the answers rolling on this. I loved how in the last scenario how people kept adding as the
Yeah.
discussion went on. That was awesome. And we can actually share out these results with you if people want to look at these later. They make a nice PDF that we can share. But I wanted to share another scenario and then hear from members of the equity subcommittee again. So this is a photograph from a high-rise apartment in Portland called Franklin Towers, where many low-income people, older people, and people living with disabilities reside. Last August, a thunderstorm knocked out the power during a heat wave. And this photograph here is of a woman who has diabetes and breathing problems, and she relies on medical technology that requires electricity for her to report her vital signs to doctors regularly. So during this heat wave, she was unable to, because the power was out, the apartment was able to run extension cords. You can kind of see one in the background for refrigerators, but limited use of power just to refrigerators. So she was unable to charge her medical device during the power outage, and wasn't able to communicate with her doctors. And as an added complication, the housing authority was trying to help by bringing in some food for residents, but they ended up bringing in a lot of sweets and pasta and things that were really not appropriate for someone with diabetes. So I'd love to turn the conversation back to I think Dr. Va and Rebecca. I know you had prepared this question, but Gabe, you're very welcome to contribute as well. So I'd love to look back at the Mentimeter poll and think about this woman here at Franklin Towers and just have a similar discussion, but now about extreme heat. What are we seeing here in terms of vulnerability around extreme heat? And we can pull back up the Menti poll.
I'll chime in really quickly, Dr. Va, and then please answer as well. I think just kind of continuing that conversation around the resilience piece, but I think also efficacy, and you do see some of that reflected in these different populations on here, but really not having efficacy to change their conditions or her this woman's conditions on where she lives and on the factors that are impacting her health. And I think similarly for some of the outdoor workers or migrant workers, people who are unhoused, there just is really little efficacy. And I think that as we think about policy change, programming, things like that, that really should be top of mind for us, and about how do we address that efficacy piece and really recognize that. Because I mean, even in that photo, you can see her emotion and frustration, and I just that really stood out to me. And when I looked at the populations on here, that also just kind of made me think of that.
Yeah, that's a really good point, right? Was it social agency that was brought up earlier, in terms of like hope, right? The science of hope. And you're right, that struck out to me too. In terms of, and then even look at going back to the Menti poll, looking at the populations here, like what are the cross-cutting themes? And I do believe you're correct. Like if I think about children, elderly, low income, laborers, to what degree do they have agency or social agency to change their circumstances in the environment around them, right? I'm also struck by the difference. I'm glad Mo and Kihara did this. The difference that in populations, that sort of slight differences that we see in the different scenarios. I do want to, note that one of the other vulnerable populations that I did not see come out, I saw folks that are sick, folks that with chronic disease and hints at that, those that are disabled, but I didn't see pregnant women.
Oh, no.
Yeah. But I do, going back to what Rebecca brought up, I agree. If we think of something, or as we're thinking through these scenarios, are there things we can do to encourage or strengthen the populations that are identified and their ability to change their circumstances?
Mm-hmm.
I just wanted to add to, thinking about persons with disabilities, and then thinking about disabilities that we can't always see. So maybe mental disabilities that may be hidden to us. And I was thinking about in terms of, I was really struck by the photograph of the woman, and just thinking about, a lot of these words are related to housing, or, maybe being unhoused. But then also, like, how secure is our home? And then, maybe we have a heating shelter, maybe we have a cooling shelter, but also I think it's harder for some people to leave what is the perceived security of their home, even if it's not appropriate in like an extreme heat scenario, to go to a cooling shelter. So there's a whole nother element of our vulnerability there as well. So, maybe you have mobility and are able to get to that shelter, but there's another factor that's limiting your actual willingness or ability to leave what is the perceived security of your home to get to that shelter.
Yeah. Listening to the three of you talk, and we had talked about close-knit communities and those things. I live about a few minutes away from Franklin Towers, and it was hard listening and getting these updates about how dire the situation was getting, and it made me think about the reverberation of harm. That it doesn't always have to be that it's your house getting flooded, but if you hear that everyone around you is getting, devastated by X, weather event X, it really takes a toll on the community itself. And I know that one of the things that bothered me and my folks on our streets was like, what can we do? We don't know how to help. We don't know what to do. And I think that ultimately that chips away at community morale, and at the ability to feel that resilience that we talked about, and it happened multiple times that summer. It didn't just happen once, and it really kind of that begins to really sort of bring down, that energy and that tightness, that feeling of like we're in this together.
Yeah.
Go
Oh,
ahead.
sorry, please. No, please go, Dr. Ba.
I think you're muted, Dr.
Sorry,
Ba.
but as Mo's bringing that up, and I'm again looking at the populations, you're right. Like going back to even the discussion earlier with the rainstorms, how, like, who will, who checks in on these folks, right? Like, who is that? And can you name them? It's really hard when you think about like those that are unhoused, homeless. Who would check in on them on a routine way, especially if they can't get information.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, just to extend that, I think that the information piece is really important. Like, is there a cooling center? And if there is, do people know about it? Do they have a way to get there? The photo of the woman in the wheelchair, I think, speaks to another barrier when you are restricted in your mobility, how much harder it makes it for you to be able to go someplace. And I think just kind of keeping with the psychological piece, the perception around like, I'll just, stick this out, I can handle this heat, and maybe not recognizing the impact that that's having on someone's health or on their family member's health. And I'm glad that Kate put in the chat around, she added victims of domestic violence. And I think that's a really important addition to this recognition of different populations. So thank you, Kate, for adding that.
Yeah, I appreciated that as well. It ties up to what Gabe had said about like, going someplace or not leaving someplace, yeah. Great. I'm going to move on to talk a little bit about policy with Quijada. And we'll start with sustainable and resilient infrastructure and what we have to think about in terms of policies.
Yes, here we are.
So we want to demonstrate how equity, accessibility, diversity, and inclusion play out in these conversations through our case studies, and then really the way that we have to think about them when we think about policy, right? So we think about equity. Are there policies in place or in the works that focus on the most vulnerable in our communities? And and that is prioritizing them first. When we think about policy and it's blending with accessibility. Are we providing additional funding to low-income communities so that they have access to the same needed improvements? Here in Maine, here in Portland, culverts that reduce flooding in the same way that wealthier communities have those built in, you know? Diversity in policy. Have we taken into account a variety of perspectives, such as the youth, new Mainers, older people, people with medical issues, people with disabilities, rural folks, urban folks? These are all the things that kept popping up during those Mentimeters, and for Quijada and I, the idea of engaging those communities to get that feedback is essential. And policy that really aims to diversify the feedback and the input is really key. And then lastly, when we think about this, we think about inclusion. Have we included the populations that we mentioned above to work on identifying the critical needs and the solutions? Are they involved in an authentic way and part of improving their own lives and improving their chances of survival, of bringing down that vulnerability? So we just kind of want to give you a look at that.
Yeah, and I appreciate how you delivered that so much, Mo, because I think oftentimes we just hear these words, equity, accessibility, but they're shared in the abstract, and we don't necessarily see how they apply to real case studies and real impacts. And so it is a helpful activity, I think, to try to take these concepts and think about, okay, how would it apply to something like sustainable and resilient infrastructure? And how would that be different than addressing policy around extreme heat, right? And kind of using these lenses again and again to really interrogate that topic and think about it from a lot of different angles.
Mm-hmm.
So that brings us to we'd like to bring you into to thinking about how to connect these ideas that we've been discussing today to policy a bit more. So essentially, if we know that climate change will impact different populations differently, and we know that it will do more harm to some populations than others, then how can we plan for this in the way that we make decisions and create policy?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And Mo, I know you want to talk to folks about the curb cut effect.
Yeah, I do want to highlight a comment that just came in about making sure that the language is accessible and in a way that folks can interact with it, right? And I think that's always really important to think about, especially with something as like wonky and serious as policy. So yeah, the curb cut is something that I think about all the time when we're talking about design, when we're talking about policy. This is a sidewalk that has the flattened part of it, and originally, the curb cut was designed to ensure that people in wheelchairs could get across the street safely. Without this incline, it was really difficult for them to do that. But what's really wonderful about the curb cut effect is that the unintended positive consequences of this was that other populations were able to also have an easier time crossing the street. So women with strollers, families, with smaller children, they were able to get without as much efforts, joggers, bicyclists. This actually ended up increasing the accessibility for these groups. And so when we think about designing, if we design for the most vulnerable, and so in terms of policy, if we create policy for the most vulnerable, it'll, using the curb cut effect, it will have reverberations that are positive for other communities as well.
Yeah, I love this concept, Mo. And I was actually reading the other day that text messaging was actually originally developed for the deaf community. and then ended up being something that was shared more broadly. So it's interesting, I think that's just another example of curb
Yeah.
cut dynamics. Yeah.
Wow.
Well, I wanted to share some resources. So as we think about the curb cut, it shows us the value of engaging with the most vulnerable populations in the state, so that when we design policy, we are really thinking of protections and resources for these populations. And then the question is, so how do we know what these populations need? So the first step to this work is identifying what voices you need to hear from. And I think we've been doing that all day through the Mentimeter polls, right? We've started to look at different topics and explore who the different populations are who are vulnerable. But the second part is actually listening to these communities and hearing what their needs and priorities are. So the University of Maine's Mitchell Center team is here to help you with learning from the experiences of people within the state. So they're currently conducting interviews, focus groups, and surveys to learn from a variety of the more vulnerable populations in the state, so that you all are aware of their needs and priorities as you draft your climate policies. And these initial findings should be available this spring as you develop your policies. So just wanted to highlight that that's a resource for you. And we want to highlight some different questions that you can consider. So as you craft these policies to ensure that they work for all Maine people, particularly the most vulnerable, we wanted to share some guiding questions, and this is how we'll close today. So we encourage you to use these questions in your working groups. These questions draw from some other resources that you've seen before, and I just wanted to remind you of these. One is the Maine Climate Council Working Group 2024 deliverable template. So there's actually some questions around equity that kind of mirror some of these in that document. And then the March 2023 Equity Subcommittee report actually provides some recommendations in that document related to equity for particular climate impacts in the state. So I think both of those can be really helpful. But when we look at this guiding question around who are all the populations impacted by this climate change issue, you now know how to do this. We've been doing it all day in the Menti poll, but the first thing you could do is just a brainstorming session to try to identify those populations. But you may actually want to also follow that up with a little research where you say, here's what we know, from our gut, from our experience, but there may be other populations in the state who are impacted, who we don't necessarily know about when we think about this topic. And so then that really brings us to potentially considering the data that we had before, and Mo's going to say a little bit more about that.
Yeah. Yeah. So of these populations, who are the most vulnerable, right? That we keep asking that question. And if you turn to the Maine Social Vulnerability Index, in that first tool that we shared with you, you can start to uncover some other populations, and you can begin to see the multiple identities. And I think I really want to highlight Gabe's comment about certain places, just because they're lower vulnerability doesn't mean they don't have vulnerable people in those, right? So when we think about Maine as a state is more vulnerable to flooding, and we know coastal communities are more vulnerable to flooding, we then need to think about is everybody equally as vulnerable in that community? And if not, who are those that aren't? And how do we reach out to them? How do we get them to come to the table, participate in helping us answer those questions, and then help us provide support and stick with it so that we come out with a positive outcome at the other end of it. I always think about the disability rights movement of the 70s, and the slogan, nothing for us without us. And we want to be able to approach these kinds of policy questions and design questions with the folks that are being really impacted, and helping them get to the table is really our responsibility at times.
Great. And here's a few other questions to consider. So when you review the final recommendations of the Equity Subcommittee report and eventually the University of Maine Mitchell Center engagement report, I think it's really important to look at, okay, what am I hearing about the particular policy that I'm working on when I look at these documents, because these documents are resources, but only when you connect them, right? So we have a few questions to close with that I think will be useful to you. And the first is, what are the concerns and needs of vulnerable groups in relation to this policy? So just to give an example, people living with disabilities or medical issues, they may have particular concerns about loss of power because it could threaten their health in ways where it does not affect other people as much. And so they may want to see particular accommodations in the policy that address their needs, like a space where there's community generators reserved for people with health issues, so that they can go to those spaces and charge devices or use medical devices. And maybe they will also want to see transportation to and from those spaces from their homes when there's a climate disaster. So that's just an example here. Another question that I think is really important to consider is, what are negative experiences vulnerable groups have had in the past that could be prevented by this policy? So we want to learn from the past. So just for example, to go back to that Franklin Towers example, a lot of residents in that community felt unacknowledged and frustrated by the response to the power outage. So how can we think through policy so that people don't have similar experiences from that in the future? How can we learn from those kinds of examples? And a lot of that is from listening to stories of communities. And the last question here is really trying to do some harm prevention. So how might aspects of your policy inadvertently do harm to certain vulnerable groups, and how could you address those potential harms? So for instance, let's imagine there was legislation to create more warming centers. How would you ensure that policy is actually equitable? So, for urban people, they may be able to walk to warming centers, kind of depends on the community. But for rural people, if they have trees down and a lack of transportation, maybe more warming centers in that community needs to look different than it would look in an urban area. So really the question is, how do we create access to funding and technical assistance to invest in climate ready infrastructure so that communities aren't left out?
Yeah.
But we want to just sort of remind people that the policy is only part of the picture here.
Yeah. I mean, policy is not going to fix everything without cultural changes, including shifts in mindsets and changes in our practices.
And I think it's really easy to get caught in this mindset of this is the way we do things because this is the way we've always done things. But oftentimes it is only the way that certain people do things. And if, the more that we start to listen to other perspectives, we start to see that there's actually a lot of different ways to approach problem solving.
Yep. Great. So let's wrap up. No, let's wrap up with some next steps.
Yeah, so we've got a few next steps to consider. So first of all, I hope that you take some of what we talked about today back to your committees and have some deeper discussions about these issues. The questions that we just shared, we will put into a questions to consider handout, and we can share that with the Menti poll PDF results so that you can go back and look at the Menti polls if you want to, because that might be helpful to some of you in your work groups. Stay tuned for the Mitchell Center results as they come in. And really, we hope that all of the above can inform policy and action. Obviously, you have the great resource of the Equity Subcommittee, who will be helping with this work as well. So we hope that this was useful today. David, I'll leave it to you, but we do have a sort of closing poll that we could do, but I'll leave it to you in terms of how much time we have left for everything. But Mo and I really enjoyed being your co-facilitators today. Thanks for the space to talk with you about this really important issue. And we hope you keep working on this throughout your policy development.
Yeah, absolutely. This is awesome. And I'm glad we had the opportunity and the privilege to be able to bring this up for you guys. So thank you very much.
Well, I want to thank both of you. And we actually do have a few minutes. And so even though we are 92 panelists right now, I want to open up the possibility if folks want to react. I've seen a bunch of stuff in the chat, but I'm curious among our 92 panelists right now, are there thoughts that are jumping out at you, something maybe that hasn't popped into the chat yet, or a question you might have for Mo or Kihara? We can do this about 5 minutes if folks have some thoughts that they want to share. I've seen some really interesting considerations in the chat. Other things that folks want to share? Tom Welch, go ahead.
Yeah, what's interesting to me is how this discussion of how to address vulnerable populations in the context of climate change actually may provide a vehicle for addressing some problems that should be addressed whether or not there is climate change. And our treatment of vulnerable communities and engagement and understanding of the issues and listening. So it may actually, ironically, provide a beneficial opportunity to move the needle a little bit on the political discourse in terms of how to address the economic and social inequities.
Thanks, Tom. Yeah. Linda Silka, excuse me.
Thank you. What a great presentation. So many different ideas there that are really helpful in moving us forward. Of course, part of what I want to do is follow you both around and keep learning from you. But in the meantime, it also seems like it's real helpful if each of us thinks about maybe 5 people we're going to encounter today and how we can tell them a couple of things about what we learned and how it's useful so that we keep spreading the word from this important work. So thank you.
Oh, now I want to follow you around, Linda. That's an awesome idea. I love that.
Good.
Great.
Speaking of that idea, one of the things I was going to suggest we do before we finish up, and this is for all 163 of us that are on this call right now, is I think it's helpful, and this is for ourselves as much to share amongst the group, but in the spirit of what Linda just said, I think it's helpful to take just a minute and write down something for yourself, whatever you have at your desk. I use a fair number of sticky notes on my computer and stuff. If you've got something handy to write on and you want to write yourself a note right now, all of us, all 163 of us, what do we not want to forget about this? And so I encourage you to do that. And once you've written that for yourself, if you want to share it in the chat or somewhere else, that's great. But I really want to help, let's make a note for ourselves, a mental sticky note, a physical sticky note, a note in your notebook. What do you not want to forget about this conversation? I'd encourage all of us to do that. Tora, go ahead, as folks are doing this. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you so much. All morning has been a really helpful conversation. I wanted to just step in. So I'm part of the resilience working group and I'm in the subgroup looking at psychological resilience. And one of the things that we've been working on is sort of unpacking what that really means and recognizing that psychological resilience pervades everything that the Climate Council is doing and underpins and really can contribute to our success in achieving our goals. And among a few considerations that are kind of bubbling up, one is that the considerations for where the psychology of folks comes in is really varied. So there's the psychology and mental health of folks who are being impacted either through crisis events or over the long term by climate impacts, and supporting them and understanding that, as we've been discussing, they have intersecting vulnerabilities and variables and challenges that play into it. There's also the psychology around understanding vulnerability, accepting the reality of change that can happen to you, and finding the agency and the hope to make change and choose change. And then there's those of us who are trying to help people move in that direction and find ways to bounce forward and find new ways forward. And that we, on the one hand, need to find our own agency and hope, and on the other, we need to find the tools that help and engage in the psychology of hope and support the psychology of hope among the communities that we're working with, and knowing, as we've discussed, that that can be really variable, that different people come to it in different ways, that some people may still be impacted by climate change without actually believing that the cause of their problems is climate change. And we need to find ways to engage with dignity and engage with people where they are in order to move those efforts forward. And we're intersecting with, the psychology and mental health issues that our state has, regardless of climate change and its impacts, right? And that talk about curb cuts, investing in mental health and investing in health in general, for instance, will help to make us more resilient to climate change. Specifically. So these are some of the things, and hopefully our recommendations that will rise from these discussions will, help to inform what everybody's doing in the other working groups.
Thanks. Yeah.
I'm so glad that you said that, because I keep reading your comment, and it's a really great point. And one of the things that, I know that Kihara and I would suggest as community engagement specialists is to check yourself and make sure that you're dialoguing and not debating. That's always going to go further. That's going to draw people in, and I just want to know why. I want to know why you feel this way. I want to know where that came from. We don't need to debate it. I know my stance, you know your stance. I just want to know more about it. So that's a strategy that we would say you could walk away with right now, is to just check that as you have interactions.
Really important fundamental psychological reality is that telling people doesn't make them learn what you tell them. That's not how people learn. People learn because they trust you. They feel like you're in it with them. And so we so tend to say, oh, I'm just going to tell you the facts. I'm going to tell you what my truth is, and think that will change folks' belief and behavior. And it doesn't. Walking with them is how you accomplish that. And so that's a crucial, fundamental psychological reality.
So as Kihara closes us out
sure.
here, I would love to see a little bit more in the chat of what folks wrote. I made a little sticky for myself about the social connectedness piece that really came out today that I don't want to forget about. I'd love to see in the chat. And when you hit the chat button, do everybody, not just host and panelists, but if you can chat to everyone, that includes folks who are observing today. I'd love to see those go through in the chat as we're finishing up. So what's something you don't want to forget about this conversation? Kihara, last words on this, and then we'll do a quick wrap up for the council.
Yeah, thanks, David. I really appreciate the discussion that we just had, and Tora and Tom, the points that you surfaced, I think are great points for us to marinate on as we leave today. One thing that I'm thinking a lot about is how social vulnerability can make people more vulnerable to climate change, but climate change can also cause social vulnerability. An example that I'm thinking of with that is that climate change might displace a family and create homelessness, right? And I'm thinking to adverse childhood experiences, the ACEs scores, which is a score that probably some of you know about, which is for children who are particularly vulnerable. One of the ACEs scores is for children that is a predictor of a multitude of challenges later in their life is homelessness when they're young, right? But climate change might be creating those impacts that then create further social vulnerability down the line. So it's a really helpful place for us to close today, I think. And thank you so much, everyone, for the comments in the chat and the conversation.
Thank you so much.
All right. And that's hard to do over Zoom. So hats off to Kihara and Mo for leading us through that and doing that in an interactive way over Zoom. I'm really impressed. Thanks, everyone. And thanks for hanging in, everyone, on doing this in this virtual format. All right. So this is the end of our meeting today, but before we go, I want to just share a thing about next meetings. And I don't know, Hannah or Melanie, if you want to say anything about this, I'm happy to just roll through it. But Hannah and Melanie, some closing things here about final meetings and anything else we want to say as we finish up today.
Sure. Thanks, David. We had planned on doing the meeting we did today as Zoom, recognizing that people are pretty busy this time of year, particularly with the legislature in session, but we are looking forward to seeing everybody in person on June 18th at the Augusta Civic Center. And again, kudos to Kihara and Mo for taking us through that exercise this morning. That was really cool to see how the word maps come together in Mentimeter and sort of the common themes that bubbled up across so many of the questions that you asked. That was just a great exercise, and really appreciate all the input from the panelists this morning, the great comments in the chat. And it sounds a little cheesy, but I would say that, it gives me a lot of hope about the plan that we're developing to see a conversation like this. We learned during the pandemic that we were able to come up with a really robust climate plan for the state. And it's just wonderful to see us moving forward with those ideas and coming up with new policy initiatives to build on the great work that's already been done. And I think that's it. We've got a few reports that we've already mentioned this morning. The Science and Technical Subcommittee report is coming, the Mitchell report, and the Equity Subcommittee report. So there'll be more resources for all of you to refer to as you're doing your work with the working groups. And thanks in advance for all the hard work that you're going to be doing in the next couple of months with those working groups. And I think that's it, unless Hannah has anything she wants to add.
Melanie said it all very well. Loving the.
Hang on one second, Hannah. You just dropped off your mic for 1 second. There you go.
I'm here. I'm here to only say agree with Melanie and appreciating the chat, and I think all of the engagement. And I think as Melanie said, carry this conversation, both what we heard from the scientists and what we all were thinking about during this presentation, into your work over the next couple of months. And again, I just appreciate everyone's time and commitment to this process in solutions, building hope, and grappling with challenging topics where I know we can all make a big difference. So just thank you, Melanie and David, and especially Kiata and Mo and all of the scientists. I think it was really great 3 hours that is ending on time. So great job, David.
So I have been enjoying watching the chat go by. I hope you have as well. We will make sure that when we do a summary from today, we'll grab all that good stuff in the chat right now and give it back to you all, so you keep that sense of hope and learning. And so thanks, everyone. We'll end here. Working groups, we're in the thick of it. It's the real deal now. Climate counselors, we'll see you in June with the output of all the hard work from the working groups. Take care, everybody. Have a great rest of your day.